Hey everyone, welcome back. If possible, you can support me via PayPal or become a channel member to help me keep this channel running. Thank you. Now let's get back to the story of Sword of Coming audio series. Chapter 1061, Child in the Corner. It was evening and Daizhong couldn't help but feel slightly puzzled as she stood in the wine shop. Chen Pingan had just left in the morning, so why was he already back for more wine? Business was quite good, and to say nothing of empty tables, there wasn't even an empty chair at the wine spot. This caused Chen Pingan's mood to improve as he purchased wine. Daizhong handed over a pot of the cheapest wine and asked, "What's this all about? I encountered some matters, and Ningyao told me she wasn't angry." She adamantly stated that she wasn't angry, but I have a nagging feeling that this isn't the case, Chen Pingan replied in helplessness. Daizhong didn't take pleasure in his misfortune, and she consoled him by saying, "Ningyao always speaks frankly, so she definitely isn't angry if she says so. You're overthinking things." "Shopkeeper, am I a better judge of people? Or are you a better judge of people?" Chen Pingan replied in a gloomy voice. Daizhong could feel at ease and take pleasure in Chen Pingan's misfortune now, and she replied, "Then second shopkeeper, you can drink some more wine. Our wine shop will provide as much wine as you want. And as per the rules, regular customers can't drink on credit unless they've just broken through." Chen Pingan squatted on the side of the street with a pot of wine and a dish of pickled vegetables, and squatting beside him was an alcoholic sword cultivator who often visited the wine shop, the type who would die if he didn't drink for a single day. He was at the Dragon Gate tier, and his name was Han Rong. Just like Chen Pingan, he would only drink Bamboo Sea Small World wine when he visited, the cheapest wine at 1 snowflake coin per pot. At first, Chen Pingan told Daizhong that attracting this type of customer was most important, and that treating them well was crucial, leaving her a little baffled. Seeing this, Chen Pingan was left with no option but to patiently explain the reason. The friends of alcoholics were generally alcoholics as well, and these alcoholics liked to always drink at the same place. Compared to those people who would occasionally drink a pot of fine wine by themselves, these alcoholics, who would feel a strong urge to return and order another pot of wine immediately after leaving, were the best customers to attract. Recurring business was always better than one-off transactions. At the time, Daizhong had surprisingly recorded these words in the accounts book, regarding them as priceless words of wisdom, which made Chen Pingan extremely anxious. The shopkeeper was truly not cut out for doing business. In fact, how had she managed to run her miscellaneous shop for more than 10 years? Yet, he had only worked as a wandering merchant for several years. Perhaps he genuinely had some aptitude when it came to doing business? Han Rong smiled and asked, "Second shopkeeper, are you drinking to drown your sorrows? What happened? Were you kicked out of home for being too touchy? It's okay. I'm experienced with women, so let me teach you a brilliant tactic. How about this? You can treat this as payment for the wine. This is a great deal for you." Chen Pingan ate some pickled vegetables and took a sip of wine, replying in a leisurely voice, "Listening to your suggestions will truly cause me to become irritated and shameless. In any case, I'm simply here to drink and relax. And are we not aware of who should be teaching whom? What did Brother Han write on the safety tablet on the wall? Have you forgotten after drinking so much? There's something I don't understand. There are so many safety tablets in the wine shop, but only a single one is hanging with its name side facing the wall. Say, Brother Han, are you treating this wine shop as a place to confess? Will that young lady dare to visit our wine shop to drink in the future? You need to pay double for today's wine. Don't haggle with me, okay? Brothers speaking about money is a surefire way to hurt the relationship," Han Rong said. He slowly took a swig of wine before sighing with emotion and remarking, "There are countless single men here, but there are few men as loyal and love-struck as I am. If I truly succeed in the future and end up with that beautiful woman, then I'll regard it as your wine shop bestowing blessings on me. I'll definitely visit to return the favor at that time, and I'll directly order 2 pots of wine that cost 5 snowflake coins each." Chen Pingan smiled and said, "Easy done. I'll even throw in an extra pot of wine for free at that time." "For real?" Han Rong asked. Chen Pingan nodded and replied, "Yes, but the type that costs 1 snowflake coin each." "That's far too casual," Han Rong exclaimed in disappointment. "Second shopkeeper is young and successful, having outstanding achievements and being regarded as a prodigy among prodigies in the younger generation. Hold it right there, Brother Han. Are you going to compensate me if I throw up my wine? Chen Pingan asked in mock anger. Daizhong was completely won over by Chen Pingan's business news as she stood in the distance and watched the second shopkeeper enjoy a spirited conversation with the customer. Chen Pingan had also said before that he genuinely liked to drink at the Sword Chi Great Wall. This was because at the Majestic World, many wine shops would discriminate based on the status of the customers, with powerful individuals receiving more wine and less powerful individuals receiving less wine. Han Rong chuckled giddily, suddenly recalling a matter and saying, "Second shopkeeper, you've read a lot of books, so can you think of a few cringy poems? They don't need to be good poems, and something like dreaming that the Azure God visits to pour me wine will do. The young lady whom I like is somehow fond of these poems, so you need to help your brother out with this. Regardless of whether this works out or not, I promise that I'll drag an entire table of alcoholics over as thanks. I'll adopt your surname if we don't finish 10 pots of wine. Do you think pretentious poems are like wine, served bowl after bowl as long as one is rich? Sorry, but you can keep dreaming." Chen Pingan shook his head and continued, "In any case, I'm not married yet, so I'm not accepting any sons." Han Rong raised his wine bowl and said, "Us brothers have a good relationship, so why don't we take a swig of wine first? You should at least come up with one poem for your brother, and even 1 or 2 lines will suffice. If I don't become your son, can I become your grandson instead?" Chen Pingan raised his wine bowl and replied, "How about I mull over this afterward? However, to be completely honest with you, whether or not I gain inspiration to compose a poem depends entirely on whether I have enough wine to drink or not." Han Rong immediately turned around and shouted to Daizhong, "Shopkeeper, I'll grab the bill for second shopkeeper's pot of wine." Daizhong nodded in response, and she felt that if Chen Pingan were to focus on selling wine, he could expand the wine shop to the city wall in just a few years' time. A tall and slender woman gracefully walked over, arriving in front of the second shopkeeper, who was currently explaining the meaning of fleeting time to Han Rong. She smiled and asked, "May I please trouble young Master Chen for a brief moment?" Chen Pingan smiled and nodded in response, turning around and saying to Han Rong, "It's not important if you don't understand, and the most important thing is that she understands." He then walked along the street with the young woman and said with a smile, "Thank you for reaching out, Miss Yu." The young woman was none other than Yu Chia, who had left Fan Dach completely heartbroken. Yu Chia's expression was slightly unnatural, but it wasn't long before she said slowly in a soft and gentle voice, "I heard about the events that night, and even though I'm no longer in a relationship with Fan Dach, I still have to apologize to you, young Master Chan. After all, this happened because of me, and I caused you to suffer. Perhaps it isn't suitable for me to say this, and you might even feel like my apology is shallow and insincere. No matter what, I still hope that you can sympathize with Fan Dach. He's truly a very good person, and I'm the one who has wronged him. I wouldn't have tolerated a scolding from Fan Dach if he weren't a good person," Chen Pingan said. "Who hasn't become drunk before? If a man murmurs a woman's name when he's drunk, then he definitely has sincere feelings for that woman. As for scolding others when they're drunk, their words shouldn't be taken seriously at all." Yu Chia curtsied and said, "Thank you, young Master Chan. Then I won't disturb you and your friend anymore." Following Yu Chia's departure, Chen Pingan returned to the wine shop and squatted down, continuing to drink by himself. Han Rong had already left, and he naturally hadn't forgotten to pay for Chen Pingan's wine. What was that all about? Daizhong shuffled over and asked. Yu Chia came to apologize for Fan Dach's outburst, Chen Pingan explained with a smile. Daizhong pursed her lips before saying, "And that's only because she's afraid of offending Chen Sanqiu, the leader among the group of young masters that includes Fan Dach and the others. If Chen Sanqiu truly criticizes Yu Chia and gives her a bad reputation, then she doesn't need to dream about hanging out with them in the future." Chen Pingan smiled and didn't say anything. Things naturally weren't so simple. "Why don't we make a bet about whether Fan Dach will appear here or not?" Chen Pingan suddenly suggested. "I wager that he'll appear," Daizhong said with a nod. Chen Pingan smiled and was just about to nod in confirmation. Seeing this, Daizhong changed her mind and said, "Actually, forget about the bet." Chen Pingan had an expression of regret, and Daizhong felt like she had made the correct decision to pull out of the bet. Unexpectedly, however, Fandach turned up after less than 15 minutes. Daizhong rolled her eyes. Fandach was extremely hesitant after he arrived at the wine shop, but in the end, he still purchased a pot of wine and squatted down beside Chen Pingan. Chen Pingan smiled and said, "Miss, you said that she was the one who has done wrong by you." Fandach lowered his head, and tears immediately streamed down his cheeks. He didn't drink and he held his wine bowl just like that. Chen Pingan raised his wine bowl and lightly touched it against the white bowl in Fandach's hand, saying, "Don't get too hung up on this, so much so that you yearn for war to start tomorrow. Feeling like dying on the battlefield to the south of the Sword Chi Great Wall is a form of liberation." Fandach took a large swig of wine and asked, "How did you know?" "I guessed," Chen Pingan replied. "Don't have a falling out with Sancho for my sake, or remain friends but have grudges in your hearts," Fandach said. "You're overthinking things," Chen Pingan said with a chuckle. "That would be best," Fandach replied with a nod. "Even if you hadn't come here to look for me today, I would have headed over to look for you," Chen Pingan said. Fandach smiled bitterly and said, "I appreciate your concern, but this isn't going to help with anything. You definitely feel terrible right now, with even the smallest of sounds and movements feeling exaggerated and painful. However, I know a method to deal with this. Do you want to try?" Chen Pingan asked. "What method?" Fandach asked in puzzlement. Chen Pingan smiled and explained, "Fight with someone, and you'll feel better when your physical pain matches your mental pain. You're not using this as an excuse to beat me up, are you? You're holding such a strong grudge simply because I smashed a single wine bowl?" Fandach asked with a skeptical expression. "You can piss off if you don't believe me," Chen Pingan responded. In the end, Fandach ultimately decided to follow Chen Pingan to the corner of the alley. However, before Fandach could even assume a fist stance, Chen Pingan's fist had already rocketed over and knocked him down. After being struck down several times, Fandach's face was caked in blood as he shakily stood up and stumbled along the street. Chen Pingan was calm and relaxed after finishing his job, and he walked alongside Fandach and asked with a smile, "How do you feel?" Fandach wiped his face and looked down at his hand, after which he looked up and cursed, "Feel better my ass. If I return like this, Sancho and the others will think that I've truly lost my mind." Chen Pingan smiled and replied, "What does it matter for a man to vomit some blood? Otherwise, you've been drinking my bamboo sea small world wine for nothing. Remember to pay before you leave and you can forget about that white bowl. I'm not that type of stingy person, and I won't remember those kinds of trivial matters." Chen Pingan stopped and said, "I have some matters to attend to." Fandach walked to the wine shop by himself. Chen Pingan turned around and asked with a chuckle, "I didn't frighten you, did I?" It was the young boy Zhang Jiazhen. Zhang Jiazhen shook his head and replied, "I wanted to ask about the character study. How should this character be understood, according to Mr. Chen's understanding?" "There's another explanation for the character study," Chen Pingan replied. "It can be understood using the three words, person, not, and hurrying, with a similar definition to the character slow. The character steady hence implies a person being slow and not wrong, but eventually pursuing speed." Zhang Jiazhen thought about this for a moment before smiling knowingly and looking up, gazing at Chen Pingan, who was holding his hands inside his opposite sleeves. "Mr. Chen, I don't have the aptitude for practicing martial arts or learning sword techniques, so if I have free time in the future and Mr. Chen is coincidentally near the wine shop as well, can I come over and ask Mr. Chen to explain characters to me?" he asked. "Of course. I'll be frequently visiting this area in the future," Chen Pingan replied with a smile. Zhang Jiazhen winked at Chen Pingan. Chen Pingan turned around, only to see Ning Yao walking over. Zhang Jiazhen bade farewell before turning around and running away. Chen Pingan briskly walked over and asked in a soft voice, "Why have you come here? Did you drink again?" Ning Yao asked. Chen Pingan was rendered speechless. He smelled of wine right now, so would he not be beaten half dead if he dared to lie and refute this? Ning Yao suddenly reached over and held his hand. The two of them didn't say anything, walking past the wine shop and continuing down the street just like that. "Why aren't you saying anything?" Ning Yao asked. Chen Pingan thought for a moment before impersonating someone and saying, "Chen Pingan, Even if you're fortunate enough to find yourself a wife in the future, she'll most likely be a scatterbrained person. Ning Yao was rendered speechless in a rare display, and after remaining silent for a brief moment, she chuckled to herself and narrowed one eye, raising a hand and bringing her index finger and thumb an inch apart before seemingly saying to herself, "Not even this much?" She felt slightly puzzled when she noticed that Chen Pingan had stopped in his tracks. However, the two of them were still holding hands, so she glanced back, only to see that Chen Pingan's lips were quivering for some unknown reason. His voice was hoarse as he asked, "What will you do if there comes a day when I leave this world first? What will you do if we also have children at that time?" Chen Pingan was no longer the young boy wearing straw sandals in Clay Vase Alley, nor was he the little boy carrying a large basket of medicinal herbs. However, he couldn't help but mysteriously feel sad whenever he thought about this scenario, becoming increasingly sad the more he thought about it. Pain that could be spoken aloud would gradually ease, while pain that was secretly hidden would only accumulate and grow. Year after year, this hidden pain was like a lonely mute hiding in a corner of his heart, curled up in a ball. When this child looked up, he would silently lock eyes with his older self, not saying a single word. The spring wind called over a curtain of spring rain. Chen Pingan was sitting under the eaves and flipping through the notes of a literati, and he stood up at this moment and reached forward to catch the raindrops. Before returning to the Ning residence from the city wall, Chen Qingdu had asked Chen Pingan whether he wanted to leave a bonded candle over there. That way, even if he died in battle to the south of the Great Wall, he would at least still have a second chance at life, even if the foundations of his great Tao were damaged. However, the first step of rubbing one's soul onto a tablet was very grueling. So grueling, in fact, that ordinary cultivators couldn't withstand the pain. When gods and deities in the majestic world punished their subordinate ghosts and Een spirits by extracting their souls and using them as lamps, the torture didn't necessarily come completely from the pain, but rather from the extreme length of time that their souls were burned for. When looking at the short-term pain, the pain of this punishment didn't hold a candle to the pain of having one's soul etched onto a tablet. The second step was to light a candle at one's ancestral hall. After enduring the first step and completing the second, the biggest shortcoming of the bonded candle was how much it would cost to maintain. The candle wicks were crafted using a secret immortal technique, essentially meaning that cultivators would be burning a large amount of immortal coins each day. As such, it was generally only extremely wealthy sect-level forces in the majestic world that would light bonded candles in the ancestral hall for their most important direct disciples. Of course, the first barrier to overcome was whether or not an immortal force knew this technique, and the second barrier to overcome was the physical crafting of the bonded candles. Afterward, maintaining the bonded candles and the corresponding mountains of immortal coins would also be a huge expenditure for the ancestral halls. This was because bonded candles couldn't be extinguished once lit, or else they would instead trigger a backlash and wound the corresponding cultivator's soul. If that were to happen, then suffering a fall in cultivation base would be very likely. The third step was to use the bonded candle to reconstruct one's Yin soul and Yang soul, a process that wouldn't necessarily succeed. Even if a cultivator succeeded, they would still suffer a huge hit to their future potential on the path of the Great Tao. Taking this into account, crafting a bonded candle was genuinely a last resort, a desperate measure to mitigate potential dangers used by cultivators in sect-level forces. No matter what, this was ultimately better than being killed and having their soul shattered and dispersed. If that were the case, they could only hope that their immortal force would search far and wide for their possible reincarnation, going to great pains to bring them back to the sect. However, the 3 immortal souls and 7 mortal forms of their previous life would often be severely damaged or partially missing, and it was up to fate how much could be replaced and whether they could regain their memories. It was also difficult to decide what to do with their past body. Chen Pingan returned to his senses and pushed away these thoughts, looking around to see Fatty Yen and the others. Dai Zhang was also present in a rare sight, thanks to the rain. The wine shop was averse to rain and would always be closed for business whenever the heavens opened up. However, the tables and chairs wouldn't be carried away when it rained, and they would simply be left outside. According to what Chen Pingan had taught her, Dai Zhang would close the wine shop whenever it rained or snowed, but she would place a pot of the cheapest bamboo sea small world wine and a few wine bowls on each table. They wouldn't charge money for this wine. and anyone who came across it could feel free to enjoy a drink. The only condition was that there was a limit of 1 bowl per person. Ning Yao was still cultivating at Dragon Slaying Cliff, and both Grandma Bai and Nalin Yeshing had noticed that something was slightly different about their young mistress after she returned to the Ning residence from the main street last time. She was more diligent towards cultivation. Fatty Yen had come to discuss business with Chen Pingan and Dai Zhang about buying stakes in his silk shop, while Chen Sancho and Dong Huafu were merely here to enjoy the atmosphere. They were all holding umbrellas as they walked under the eaves, then closed them and placed them against the wall. Chen Pingan held a book in one hand and a chair in his other hand as he walked into a wing room, and Fatty Yen felt as pained as could be when he looked around at the unbelievably bare room. Chen Pingan was his good brother and the Ning residence's son-in-law, so how was he living in such a shabby little space? Chen Sancho retrieved a tea set from his pocket treasure, one rumored to be a royal set from some large empire in the Middle-earth divine continent. He started brewing tea and very much wanted to invite Chen Pingan to enjoy some tea with him. However, did he dare to? Did he still want to visit the Ning residence as a guest in the future? While brewing tea, Chen Sancho smiled and said, "Thank you for your help with Fandach." Chen Pingan waved a hand, gesturing that there was no need to thank him. The literati notes on the table, a collection of essays on flowering trees and parasol shade, was a high-quality printed book that Chen Sancho had helped him purchase from Mirage Market. There were several other officially printed history books as well, and Chen Sancho had presumably spent a good sum of immortal coins to purchase them all. However, it didn't make sense to talk about money with a top-notch young master like Chen Sancho. As for Dong Huafu, who also hailed from a large and wealthy clan, he was a completely different story. He was even more creatively skillful than Chen Pingan when it came to how miserly he was, and from childhood until now, it was said that he had never spent a single snowflake coin from his own pockets. Chen Pingan almost wanted to ask someone to set up a gambling game, wagering on when Dong Huafu would actively spend his own money. At that time, he and Dong Huafu could secretly make a killing. Feeling like there was a ripe opportunity to make money, Chen Pingan mentioned this matter to Dong Huafu. Dong Huafu shook his head and replied, "I don't spend money anyway, so what's the point of earning money? It's not like my clan is short on money either." Chen Pingan immediately fell into deflated silence. This seemed like a fair call. Dai Zhang was the happiest as she laughed, but it wasn't long before she heard Chen Pingan say, "There's no need for you to spend any money. I'll have a chat with the person hosting the bet, and people will have the option to bet on you spending money within 10 days, within 1 month, or continuing not to spend money for the next month. They'll also be able to bet on the specific amount of money you spend, whether that's 1 snowflake coin, several snowflake coins, or even lesser heat coins. Afterward, I'll ask him to purposely leak some news, saying that Chen Pingan placed a huge bet on Dong Huafu spending money in the near term. However, he'll stubbornly refuse to say whether the time frame for this bet was 10 days or 1 month. In reality, however, I'll bet you won't spend any money for the next month. See, you don't need to spend money, and you can continue to drink wine while earning more money without any investment." Dai Zhang felt like the second shopkeeper was even more ruthless than Aoyang when it came to setting up these bets. Chen Sancho wanted to drink when he heard this. Yanzhuo was eager to participate and he exclaimed, "I also want to earn some money. I'll bet on Dong Huafu not spending money." Chen Pingan shot a sideways glance at him and said, "You naturally need to help the host of this bet, whom I spent a lot of money to invite over. You need to help him stabilize the situation, and when some clever gamblers are hesitating between the various options, you need to accidentally instruct a subordinate from your clan to openly walk over and place a wager. Having unexpectedly revealed your bet, news of this will spread like wildfire, and everyone will become aware of the fact that young Master Yan secretly placed a huge bet on Dong Huafu spending money within the next 10 days. This will confirm the rumors that I previously placed a bet on Dong Huafu spending money. Otherwise, these clever gamblers most likely won't take the bait. No matter how much money young Master Yan spends, it will simply take a small trip to my pockets before returning to your pockets, no? And when all is said and done, I'll make sure to split the earnings with you and Dong Huafu." Yanzhuo struck the palm of his hand with a fist and exclaimed, "What a brilliant idea!" Dai Zhang and Chen Sancho exchanged glances with each other. Dai Zhang wanted to participate, but she would only spend a small sum, something like a few snowflake coins. After all, this went against her conscience, so earning a small amount would be enough. She would be riddled with guilt if she earned too much. Chen Sancho unexpectedly shook his head and said, "Don't try to drag me into this. My conscience will ache." Dai Zhang became very hesitant after hearing this. There was a look of disdain on Chen Pingan's face as he said, "We can't use the same tactic again and again anyway, and the more we use it, the more people will grow suspicious." Chen Sancho cupped his fists and shook them at Chen Pingan, saying, "Why, thank you. I want 50% and the two of you can split the remaining 50%, Dong Huafu said frankly. Dong Huafu, I've heard that everyone in the city is aware of Ning Yao being able to defeat 100 Chen Pingans with a single hand, Chen Pingan said in a meaningful and heartfelt voice. I don't think much about this, and the recent events are more than enough to prove this. Fan Dach not only scolded me on my own territory, but he even threw a bowl at me. Despite all this, did I hold a grudge against him? Not at all. And now we've even become good friends who have forgotten our hostilities with a single smile. Dong Huafu's expression remained calm and composed as he said, "What I meant to say just then was you can take 50%, and Fatty Yen and I will split the remaining 50%. They started discussing the proper matters afterward, with both Chen Pingan and Dai Zhang each planning to take a 10% stake in Yanjua's silk shop. Chen Pingan led them to the opposite wing room, opening the door to reveal a table that was filled with seals of various styles and sizes. There were no fewer than 100 seals, and there was also a seal guide that Chen Pingan had personally put together, a book by the title of Seal Manual of the 100 Sword Immortals. Chen Pingan smiled and explained, all of the seals have been carved and inscribed, and the characters on the seals are all auspicious ones that have good omens. They're extremely suitable as gifts between men and women alike. These seals won't be given away to customers who simply buy fabric from the silk shop, and only those who give us a deposit of at least one lesser heat coin will be given a free seal. This will be on a first-come, first-served basis, and those who place a deposit earlier will be able to choose a seal first. However, the sides and backs of these seals haven't been inscribed with characters yet, and if the customers want these additional inscriptions, especially my signature, then they'll need to pay more. I'll also need more than my 10% share in profits. If female customers pay a deposit, then we can give them a small discount when they purchase garments and fabric from our shop in the future. It's just a token gesture. If they're willing to directly place a deposit of 1 grain rain coin, however, then we can afford to give them a bigger discount." Yanjua picked up a seal with the characters "The Room of Longing" and asked in a hesitant voice, "We do have some female customers from wealthy clans, and they do somewhat engage in literary arts. However, their knowledge is only very ordinary, so will they like these kinds of seals? In any case, is the material of these seals a bit too ordinary? Does it make sense to give the seals away for free at the silk shop if their quality is too good? That would be completely pointless and asking to make a loss," Chen Pingan explained. "These seals are nothing more than curios to play with and appreciate. In addition, there's not a single person in the world who doesn't like auspicious phrases and well-written characters. There are only people who haven't had the opportunity to come across them before." Chen Sancho rifled around and eventually settled his gaze on a small and exquisite seal with the characters, "My heart is set on my beloved. I think of her and I long for her." He tossed a grain rain coin to Yanjua and said with a smile, "Just treat this as placing a deposit of 1 grain rain coin at your store, so this seal is mine now." Yanjua knew that Chen Sancho was much better than he was at appraising these items, but he still wasn't too sure, so he said, "Chen Pingan, I have no issues with you and Dai Zhang taking a 10% stake each, but I'm worried that only people like Chen Sancho will take a fancy to these seals. After all, there are far too few people like Chen Sancho here, people who have nothing better to do than read. What if we don't manage to give these seals away, much less sell them? I don't really mind, given that the shop's business was already quite mediocre to begin with. However, you definitely can't blame my shop for having bad feng shui if you end up embarrassing yourself and losing face. Moreover, will our female customers truly be willing to pay a deposit first?" Chen Pingan retrieved a small notebook from elsewhere, handing it to Yanjua and replying with a smile, "Take it back and read it a few times. You can follow it word for word, and it's not like the silk shop's business will become any worse." "I want this seal," Dong Huafu suddenly interjected and said. Chen Pingan glanced over, immediately recognizing the seal. He had crafted these seals himself, so he knew that the vermilion characters on this seal read, "The journey through the mountains is too short. The sword unleashed leaves a long radiance." "You're spending money already?" Yanjua asked with a smile. "Then how are we going to proceed with the bet?" "We'll change the 40-10 split in my favor to 30-20 in my favor," Dong Huafu replied. "Deal." Yanjua responded without hesitation. Daizhong was also looking through the seals. There was a seal that read, "Limpid Radiance." Another read, "A youth with ancient dreams, gentle winds accompany sweet rain. An individual bows in greeting to a sword immortal. To the north behind me, beautiful eyes gaze longingly. The deer bleats softly, the orioles sing sweetly, I part reluctantly. Here exists the longest sword chi in the world. I dare not ascend the city wall with my sword, lest I frighten away the 3 moons." The rims of Yanjua's eyes suddenly became red when Daizhong retrieved this final seal, and he asked Chen Pingan in a quivering voice, "How should I pay if I want this seal?" Daizhong was astonished, and Dong Huafu was also stunned. There was a look of sadness on Chen Sanchio's face. After losing his arms, Yanjua's father had never ascended the city wall to gaze into the distance again, bar the time he had carried the severely wounded Fatty Yen down the city wall. Chen Pingan gently accepted the seal from Daizhang's hand and passed it to Yanjua, replying, "Even brothers need to keep clear accounts when it comes to doing business, but this seal is my present to you and not a transaction, so there's no need to talk about paying." When Ningyao returned, Fatty Yen and the others had just opened their umbrellas at the courtyard door and were about to leave. After entering the courtyard with Chen Pingan, Ningyao looked at him and asked, "What's going on?" Chen Pingan roughly explained the situation, following which Ningyao also walked over to the wing room where the seals were placed. She sat down and picked up a seal, asking, "This is what you've been busy with the past few days?" "It wasn't just for the sake of making more money." Chen Pingan nodded and replied, "Yes, it wasn't just for the sake of making money. Grandma Bai told me just then that the natural treasures needed to assist the refinement of your 4th bonded item have mostly been gathered in secret already," Ningyao said. "Rest assured, Grandpa Nalen will personally examine the items originating from outside the Ning residence's storage, and they definitely won't be tampered with by other people." Chen Pingan nodded and said, "I do need to put in some more effort. I'm always standing amidst large groups of Golden Core tier seniors, and I can't help but shake in fear and speak softly when I speak with them." Chen Pingan had broken through the barrier of the Willow Tendon tier and advanced to the Bone Chi tier at the northern complete reed continent's Lion Peak, reaching the 4th tier of Qi refinement. Confucian cultivators had a unique advantage at this tier, with their ability to nurture Qi becoming the most outstanding. As for the furnace molding tier, the 5th tier of Qi refinement, this was a tier where, in the small world of the body, one's physique was like a furnace. Buddhist and Taoist cultivators would enjoy a greater advantage at this tier. The advantage of these 2 cultivation bases was a significant and abundantly clear reason why the 3 teachings were transcendent above the 100 schools of thought. Even though the lower 5 tiers only pertained to the lower cultivation bases as its title suggested, it was also widely regarded as the mountain ascending 5 tiers. This was because these 5 cultivation bases formed the foundation of a cultivator's great Tao. Afterward, whether or not one could advance to the abode tier, the first tier of the middle 5 tiers, was just as critically important as whether or not a pure martial artist could advance past the 3rd tier. Ningyao rested her arms and head on the table and looked through the seals one by one. The abode of the acupoint opens, allowing Qi to enter and accumulate. The small world of the body houses rivers and seas of Qi. This is the abode tier. From this moment onward, cultivators can truly start to refine the spiritual energy of heaven and earth in an orderly fashion. There are 356 acupoints in the body, each of which is like a naturally arising blessed land waiting for cultivators to enter and cultivate in. At the Sword Qi Great Wall, the ability to become an innate sword talent is what separates prodigies from ordinary people. Similarly, in the savage world, the ability for demons to adopt human form early on in their life and refine Qi in this form is also very critical. After reaching the abode tier, male cultivators can advance further to the sea observation tier after they unlock 9 acupoints. It's slightly more difficult for female cultivators, and they need to unlock 15 acupoints. As a result, there are far more female cultivators than male cultivators at the abode tier. However, female cultivators at the C observation tier often possess far greater combat power than male cultivators at the same tier. You're a special case, and you already have 3 bonded acupoints as well as 3 additional acupoints that have been washed by sword chi for many years. Add to that the circulation of the 18 stops technique and the existence of 1st and 15th in 2 acupoints, and it can be said that you already have 5.5 unlocked acupoints. Once you refine your 2 remaining bonded items and accumulate bonded items of all 5 elements, you would have unlocked 7.5 acupoints. That being the case, you might very quickly advance to the C observation tier after breaking through to the abode tier. The abode tier is a tier where one's abode doors are wide open, accepting guests from all directions. This is a tormenting tier for ordinary cultivators because many can't withstand the prolonged pain of the surging spiritual energy, something akin to a tsunami. If their souls or physiques waver, they'll very likely face the risk of taking 2 steps forward and 3 steps back in their cultivation. It will be extremely difficult for them to make any progress. However, you don't need to be afraid of this, and the subsequent C observation tier won't be a big barrier for you either. You're also a pure martial artist at the same time, a Vajrabhati tier martial artist at that, and you're able to channel your true chi in a rapid and ferocious manner. Chi refiners generally need to accumulate spiritual energy slowly to open up and expand the relevant paths, but this won't be a problem for you either. In fact, you'll only face some challenges after advancing to the Dragon Gate tier. Chen Pingan smiled and said, "Thank you for going through all the trouble to gather this information." She had definitely asked Nailin Yeshing for all of this information. This was because Ning Yao didn't need to understand these matters at all when it came to her own cultivation. Ning Yao picked up a seal and held it in her hand, shaking it around as she said in a casual voice, "You probably know more about these matters than I do. If that's the case, then just pretend I didn't say anything." Chen Pingan placed his hands inside his opposite sleeves and placed them on the table, resting his chin on his arms as he gazed at the seals. Rain continued to pitter-patter down outside the wing room. It had rained most days in the past month. Relentless rain concealed the passing of spring. Chen Pingan turned his head and looked outside the window. Back in his hometown, his opening disciple, Pei Qian, had once looked at the shimmering light and shadows created by the wind blowing past the pine trees and cypress trees. The 2 of them had been sitting on the steps of the mountain at the time, and Pei Qian had secretly told her master that as long as she looked carefully, everything in the world would become incredibly slow, whether it was flowing water or living beings. They would become so slow that she would even feel worried for them. Pei Qian would often lean against the railings on the 2nd floor of the bamboo building with Nuanshu and Meili, gazing at the rain or the snow, sometimes even the icicles hanging from the eaves. If it were the latter, she would wield her hiking pole and smash them into smithereens, asking her friends to rate her swordsmanship. When Pei Qian picked on Zhou Meili too much, the small water monster would also sulk at her, shouting at the top of her lungs that she wouldn't play with Pei Qian anymore in the future. Perhaps even Zheng Dafeng, who guarded the entrance at the foot of the mountain, would be able to hear her voice. Chen Wanshu would play the role of peacemaker, following which Pei Qian would quickly make up with Zhou Meili, with chatter and laughter soon returning to the bamboo building. However, if Chen Pingan were at Downtrodden Mountain, Pei Qian definitely wouldn't dare to use her blanket as a cape and run around everywhere with Zhou Meili. If one looked around carefully at the Sword Chi Great Wall, one would still be able to find some lively and adorable things. For example, Chen Pingan would sometimes purposely navigate his talismanic boat slightly further away when he went to practice sword techniques at the city wall, allowing him to see the row of children standing on the city wall, their bodies leaning forward and their bums poking up as they pointed at the savage world and exchanged all kinds of colorful stories. Sometimes they would busily rank the sword immortals of the Sword Chi Great Wall, arguing passionately about who was more powerful between Dong Seng, Chan Shi, and Qi Tingji, the 3 elderly sword immortals. Their arguments would only become more intense if they decided to include all of the historical sword immortals of the Sword Chi Great Wall. He had heard that Guizhuzhou also practiced fist techniques very often at home, exhaling into her hands before manipulating spiritual energy, and shouting at her imaginary opponents to watch out for her flaming palm. She would grunt and shout, making her way from the entrance of the clan residence all the way to the backyard as she practiced the fist technique. After arriving there, she would then bring her hands down to compose herself, standing straight on a single leg before unleashing her tornado kick, rapidly spinning around 18 times in quick succession, no more and no less. Her fists and legs didn't discriminate, much to the misfortune of the rare and valuable flowers meticulously raised by sword immortal Guojia. Many flowers fell victim to Guojujio, and in the end the entire Guo residence became slightly on edge, worried about whether the young girl had fallen to demonic ways. Perhaps sword immortal Guojia was already regretting his decision to ground his darling daughter. When Chen Pingan went to the alley corner near the wine shop, Zhang Jiajin would occasionally visit to learn characters from him. The little boy holding the ceramic money pot was the first to shuffle over to Chen Pingan's small stool, and this allowed him to hear many more fantastical stories compared to the other children. Relying on these unique stories, he had apparently developed a close relationship with a beautiful little girl from a neighboring alley. When playing house one time, he finally didn't need to play the role of a servant or sedan chair bearer anymore, instead playing the role of the little girl's husband. Afterward, he had chuckled giddily to himself while squatting on the ground and snacking on roasted seeds with Chen Pingan. It was silent in the room, with this silence speaking louder than words. Chen Pingan visited the city wall again, but he was still unable to push through the 30 paces mark of sword chi. As such, he was still the junior brother while Zuoyu was still the senior brother. After the sword training session, Zuoyu asked the pitiful young man who was retrieving many bottles and jars and applying ointment to his wounds whether he had sent any messages to their master. Zuoyu had been quite measured during the past 2 training sessions. How is that possible? Chen Pingan asked in a righteous voice. How is business at the wine shop? Zuoyu asked. Very good, Chen Pingan replied. Zuoyu turned around. Chen Pingan hurriedly tried to mend the situation, adding, but I still need to trouble you, senior brother, with adding the icing to the cake. Zuoyu relented after hearing this and he changed the topic, asking, have you read the heavenly questions and the heavenly response that I mentioned to you before? I've read both of them already, Chen Pingan replied with a nod. Then you can offer the heavenly response and answer the 173 questions, Zuoyu said. Chen Pingan was slightly taken aback, and Zuoyu continued in a calm voice, you can start now. You can skip over the answers that you don't know. Hearing this, Chen Pingan could only muster his courage and answer the heavenly questions, just barely answering half of them correctly. Your answers aren't important, Zuoyu explained. Before Master became a sage, his most famous debate only involved arguments over 2 matters. The first matter pertained to none other than the notion of how to perform scholarly research. Should one focus on one matter at a time, slowly accumulating more knowledge and gradually achieving success? Or should one focus on a grand ambition first, preventing oneself from blindly becoming lost in tangential matters? Looking back at this, was the outcome of the debate important? The 2 sages were unable to reach a consensus, but if there were truly just one correct answer, then how did the 2 of them both become sages? Back then, Master told us that pursuing sophistication and pursuing simplicity were both legitimate methods to seek knowledge, with youth seeking knowledge and elders researching knowledge being 2 completely different stages. Young scholars should think more and seek sophistication, while elderly scholars should pursue a return to natural simplicity. As for whether one needs to establish a grand ambition first, this isn't very important. One might not be able to follow through if one establishes such a grand ambition too early on. Of course, having such a grand ambition is better than not having one, but a scholar doesn't need to worry either if they don't have one. They can gradually accumulate knowledge and experience as they study. Knowledge isn't necessarily worth anything. It's like countless gardens planted and maintained in the many wealthy residences, yet there isn't anyone guarding them, and the gates are wide open for anyone to pluck the brilliant flowers. Chen Pingan nodded and praised. Master is extremely knowledgeable, and you have a very good memory. So you couldn't help but turn around and ask, you've never stayed with Master for a long time, so where have you learned all of these flattering remarks? Chen Pingan felt slightly aggrieved as he replied, from the books, of course, especially Master's works. I've already memorized all of them. Very good, Zuoyu said with a stern expression. Die. At the training ground in the Minute Small World, Chen Pingan was currently learning sword techniques from Nailan Yeshing. Chen Pingan called this learning sword techniques, but he was actually tempering his physique. He had come up with this idea himself, and he had initially wanted senior brothers Wu Yu to unleash sword strikes at him. For some unknown reason, however, his senior brother had replied that Nailin Yeshing would be sufficient for these small matters. However, even a sword immortal like Nailin Yeshing couldn't help but hesitate, finally understanding why great sword immortals Wu Yu was unwilling to entertain Chen Pingan. This was because, according to Chen Pingan's own explanation, there would still be some risks even if his training partner were a sword immortal, and even if he were a Vajrabhati tier martial artist. One little slip-up, and Chen Pingan would need to lie on a sick bed for an entire month, something even more pitiful than applying ointment to treat his bone-deep wounds. Chen Pingan hoped that Nailin Yeshing could unleash his sword strikes from the top to the bottom, adhering to the 24 solar terms and helping him temper his spine, which contains several acupoints of the human body. Starting from the cervical vertebrae and moving down to the great vertebra Kiln Way body pillar mind valley spirit stage reaching Yang center pivot hung pivot life door lumbar Yang pass and so on. These were all critical acupoints that needed to face sword strikes, allowing this path and its barriers to be tempered by sword chi and sword intent. 2. Chen Pingan needed to integrate his breath of true chi, the fiery dragon swimming through his acupoints, as well, so he couldn't just stand there without moving. That would be a stale and ineffective way to train. Considering the different concentrations of remnant spiritual energy in his various acupoints as well, this training was a huge test for the precision of Nailin Yeshing's sword strikes. Ning Yao was sitting in the pavilion atop dragon-slaying cliff, and both Dong Buet and Dong Huafu had come to visit the Ning residence today, with the former saying that she wanted to ask Chen Pingan for a seal. Fatty Yan's silk shop was far too greedy and unscrupulous. It was better off buying the seals directly from Chen Pingan. Chen Pingan and Nailin Yeshing didn't deliberately hide anything from Dong Buet, as they practiced sword techniques. Following Chen Pingan's 4 victories in a row on the street last year, the Dong clan and the other large clans were all roughly aware of Chen Pingan's capabilities. Dong Buet was lazily leaning against the railing of the pavilion as she asked, "Ning Yao, does your heart not ache when you watch him practicing sword techniques like this?" Ning Yao didn't offer a response. Nailin Yeshing was extremely careful during this training session, so Chen Pingan was only able to reap limited benefits. Chen Pingan hadn't wanted to obtain any immediate benefits to begin with, and he climbed up dragon-slaying cliff by himself after leaving the training ground with Nailin Yeshing. Dong Buet said that she and a few of her good friends all wanted a personal seal. They weren't sure about the inscribed characters, so they would leave this up to Chen Pingan to decide. Dong Buet had even brought with her 3 pieces of fine jade suitable for carving seals, saying she would pay 1 lesser heat coin for each seal. Any leftover material would also serve as payment for Chen Pingan's labor. Chen Pingan wasn't stupid. Would it be this easy to make money? Thus he immediately looked toward Ning Yao, who nodded in response. Only after seeing this did Chen Pingan agree to the request. Dong Buet felt extremely jealous and clicked her tongue loudly, saying nothing else. During her visit, Dong Buet also talked about an interesting matter that had the smallest of links with the Ning residents, saying that a group of cultivators from some empire in the Middle Earth Divine Continent had recently arrived at Stalactite Mountain under the guardianship of a sword immortal who had come here to slay demons before. A nascent tier chi refiner was responsible for their trip, and the group consisted of 7 or 8 young prodigies from different immortal forces. They were making their way to the Sword Chi Great Wall to train their sword skills, and they would stay here for approximately 3 to 5 years. It was said that the youngest prodigy was only 12, while the oldest was only just over 30. After arriving at Stalactite Mountain, this group of cultivators had directly settled down at Plum Blossom Garden, one of the 4 private residences that enjoyed an equal standing with the Ape Rub residence. This was a clear reflection of their impressive background. Among the younger generation at the Sword Chi Great Wall, there were only 3 powerful groups of note. There was the group consisting of Ning Yao, Dong Huafu, and the others, and this group naturally had the new addition of Chen Pingan as well. Apart from them, there was the group including Qi Shou and the others, and finally the group including Peng Yuanji Gao Yeho and the others. This latter group was relatively dispersed compared to the first 2, with its members not as tightly knit and committed. Most of these young sword cultivators hailed from ordinary backgrounds, but they were willing to gather together once there was a call to arms. Their strength in number and combat power couldn't be underestimated. Young cultivators from the majestic world all needed to pass 3 trials if they wanted to come here to train. This was an old and established rule. one that both Chao Xiai and Chen Pingan had been subject to. However, there were also some unwritten rules regarding who would be responsible for conducting these 3 trials. For example, Qi Shou and his friends would be responsible for welcoming the prodigies from the Middle-earth divine continent. Ning Yao's group wasn't too fond of this tradition, and only Chen Sancho would occasionally appear to spectate the thrilling exchanges. Even so, he had only become involved a measly 2 times over the past dozen or so years. Meanwhile, Ning Yao had never once participated in these small skirmishes. Unfortunately, however, Qi Shou and the others had just been resoundingly defeated by Chen Pingan and the others, with even Pang Yuanji failing to escape unharmed. Because of this, Ning Yao's group theoretically needed to send a few members over to conduct the 3 trials. When it came to large groups of outsiders coming to the Sword Qi Great Wall to train, it was often the case that each side would send 3 members over to do battle. Of course, things would become very exciting if a single person from one side managed to defeat all 3 people from the other side. Chen Pingan found it quite interesting that he had gone from being an outsider being watched to being a member of the Sword Qi Great Wall watching someone else. Thus, he asked whether the battle could take place on the main street, where it would support his wine shop's business. Dongbut smiled and replied, "The location has always been casually decided, and there's no explicit rule stating where the trials should take place. This has generally been decided by the person conducting the final trial. If you're willing to take part in these trials, you can even hold them on the tables in Daizhang's wine shop, to say nothing of the main street." Chen Pingan shook his head and said, "If I'm wounded in battle, then the money I've made from the wine shop won't even be enough to cover the money needed for my treatment. Our wine shop is famous for its low prices, and I'm struggling to make ends meet here." An amused smile stretched across Dongbut's face. This person was truly as shameless as the rumors claimed. "It seems like Fandach is prepared to fight the first battle, and I surmise that Sancho will accompany him and fight the second battle. The third person might be Gao Yeho or Situ Weiran. It's difficult to say right now," Dong Huafu said. "What are the cultivation bases of the outsider sword prodigies?" Chen Pingan asked. Chen Pingan knew that Situ Weiran was also a golden core tier sword cultivator, but she was slightly weaker than Pang Yuanji and Gao Yeho. However, she had always been cultivating in seclusion for the past few years, and the interesting thing was that her 2 Dao mentors were both very impressive individuals. One was Sword Immortal Zhuan, the inspector from the hidden official's lineage, while the other was even more impressive, being an old sword immortal responsible for guarding the dungeons. In fact, there were even rumors claiming that this seclusive old sword immortal was a demon. In any case, might the current Situ Weiran have overtaken Gao Yeho? Dong Huafu faltered for a moment before replying, "Is there a need to know?" "There isn't a need to know, right?" Dongbut concurred. Chen Pingan glanced at Ning Yao, who seemingly had the same opinion as the 2 siblings. "Just pretend I didn't ask," he said in helplessness. Die. The sword cultivators from the Middle-earth divine continent entered Stalactite Mountain and settled down at Sword Immortal Sun Jiyuan's residence inside the city. Sword Immortal Sun Jiyuan's clan was similar to the Yen clan, engaging in frequent business with the majestic world, and thus making many friends from all over the world. However, Sun Jiyuan was most likely suffering from a small headache right now, since his guests had made an announcement that they would send 3 people forward and pass the 3 trials immediately after arriving at the Sword Qi Great Wall. The 3 trials would correspond to the Sea Observation tier, the Dragon Gate tier, and the Golden Core tier, and they would count it as their complete loss if they lost even a single battle. Chen Pingan was drinking at the wine shop today, and Ning Yao was still cultivating at the Ning residence as always. Yen Zhua and Chen Sancho were both at the wine shop, as was Fan Dach. Thus, the second shopkeeper had the rare opportunity to sit down at a table to drink. Business was booming at the wine shop, and more than a dozen sword cultivators were squatting on the side of the street and drinking. All of them were cursing loudly, saying that these little brats from outside were far too arrogant and shameless. Spittle flew everywhere as the alcoholics shouted in righteous indignation. However, for some unknown reason, they all looked at the second shopkeeper, who was dressed in azure and wearing a white jade hairpin, as they cursed. Chen Pingan smiled widely and suggested, "Shopkeeper, it's time for our shop to bump up the price of the Bamboo Sea Small World wine." The customers instantly fell silent, after which wailing echoed through the wine shop. Communicating with the second shopkeeper with her eyes, Daizhong shook her head and replied, "No, we won't bump up the price. Why should we do that? Is money very important? I'm going to order another pot of wine thanks to the shopkeeper's righteous statement," a customer directly shouted. Several other customers also shouted that they wanted to order more wine. "Grab the wine yourselves," Daizhong said with a smile. Yanjue glanced at the person who had ordered another pot of wine first, then looked at Chen Pingan and asked, using his mind's lake, "A paid actor?" Chen Pingan smiled faintly and nodded in response, replying, "Can I not keep this bunch of bastards under control? There are paid actors everywhere. Too many to even defend against." He then said to Fan Dach, "These outsider sword cultivators aren't arrogant, nor are they naive. Rather, they're plotting against you and the others. They're enjoying a huge advantage thanks to their announcement, and they've even gained some reputation and clout because of this. They would have faced certain defeat if all 3 trials were at the Golden Core tier. So, the confidence of these sword cultivators from the Middle-earth Divine Continent stems from the fact that their Sea Observation tier sword cultivator is definitely an outstanding prodigy, not only having a huge opportunity to win the first trial, but even possessing the ability to do so in a swift manner. They'll also have a good chance to win the second trial, and they won't look too bad even if they lose. Moreover, there won't be a need to participate in the third trial if they lose. How will you and the others feel? Vexed and stifled? They aren't planning to win at all, and taking several steps back, they won't try to win even if they can win. Of course, they genuinely can't win. Fan Dach, you're at the Dragon Gate tier, so I suggest that you don't participate in the trial. However, you can feel free to participate if you don't mind losing." "I do mind losing," Fan Dach replied in a resolute voice. Chen Pingan raised a thumb and said, "Impressive. As expected of Chen Sancho's friend." "This has got nothing to do with me," Chen Sancho said in exasperation. Afterward, several youths stepped onto the main street and made a beeline for the wine shop. There were young men and young women, and most of them were simply here to buy wine. However, a young man purchased a pot of Azure Divine Mountain wine for 5 snowflake coins, cracking open the clay seal and giving it a sniff as he walked. Using the official dialect of the Middle-earth Divine Continent, he then smiled and said, "By the looks of it, I need to visit the Bamboo Sea Small World after returning to the Majestic World. I need to tell them that someone is using the name of the mountain goddess to sell wine, selling it as far as the Sword Chi Great Wall. How truly impressive. Can you tolerate this?" Yanjue looked at Chen Pingan and asked. Chen Pingan nodded and smiled. "I can." A tall and sturdy young man glanced at their table and remarked with a chuckle, "And what can the scholarly sage's lineage do even if they can't tolerate it?" There was a blur, and the sturdy young man with a sword on his back was instantly lifted high into the air, with the second shopkeeper gripping his head with one hand and holding his other hand behind his back as he cocked his head and asked with a smile, "What did you say? Can you speak up?" 5 outsider sword cultivators from the Middle-earth Divine Continent had come to visit the wine shop. Apart from the young man holding a pot of wine still remaining extremely calm and relaxed, his 3 companions had already retreated slightly, ready to summon their flying swords at any moment. One of them was in their early 20s and had a stiff expression, and he was slower than his companions both when he retreated and when he channeled his spiritual energy in preparation for summoning his flying sword. There was also a lithe young woman wearing a colorful jacket and a gauze skirt adorned with 100 flowers, something extremely popular among female cultivators in the Middle-earth Divine Continent. As for the final person, he was naturally the young man carrying a sword on his back and being held up by Chen Pingan. His fist intent and astral energy were forcefully suppressed after being immobilized by Chen Pingan, and he couldn't unleash the spiritual energy from his critical acupoints, no matter how he tried. They were pushed back again and again, surprisingly unable to overcome the barriers established by Chen Pingan. His face became beet red with exertion, after which it took on shades of purple and blue, making him appear like a dead fish hanging on the wall and drying in the sun. The humiliation he felt at this moment was presumably no less than his killing intent. "He's not willing to speak, so why don't you speak for him?" Chen Pingan suggested. "I didn't quite catch what he said just then," the young man holding a wine pot said with a dazzling smile. "Do those from the second sage's lineage all suffer from hearing problems?" Chen Pingan asked with a chuckle. Chen Pingan, let go of Jiang Guanqing right this instant, the young woman demanded in anger. Don't think that you can act wantonly just because you enjoy some minor fame at the Sword Qi Great Wall. Are you going to kill someone because of a small disagreement? Disciples of the scholarly sage are truly each more short-tempered than the other. First, it was Cui Chan betraying his master, and then it was Wei Yu destroying many innate sword talents of the Middle-earth divine continent. My uncle master. The young woman gritted her teeth in anger when she mentioned her uncle master, with tears surprisingly glistening in her eyes. However, she immediately recovered and became even more furious as she said her next words. And then there's you, Chen Pingan. As a Confucian disciple and a pupil of the scholarly sage, you're actually engaging in the lowly and debauched business of selling wine? You're trampling all over the notion of decorum. Chen Pingan paid no heed to her. He genuinely wasn't too worried about these types of people who would point at others and loudly criticize them. In any case, she wasn't scolding his master, and she was only scolding his master's disciples, that being himself and his senior brothers. He was the youngest of the scholarly sage's disciples, so did he need to step forward and speak up for his senior brother? Put in a good word for Imperial Preceptor Cui Chan? Stand up for senior brothers, Wei Yu? Was this necessary? Chen Pingan didn't think so. The former wanted to transform an entire continent into an empire, inhibiting the demon tribe from traveling north and preventing the demon tribe from conquering the Parasol Leaf continent, the eastern treasured Vial continent, and the northern complete reed continent in a single breath. Meanwhile, the latter yearned to achieve the loftiest swordsmanship among those beyond the majestic world. In reality, both of them were very busy. As for Chen Pingan, he was fairly busy as well. He needed to practice martial arts, practice sword techniques, read books, refine his fourth bonded item, make money, win a bet, and carve seals. How could he not be busy? Most importantly, this young woman's words hadn't been repulsive or ill-intentioned, regardless of how reasonable or unreasonable she was. Chen Pingan could understand and accept this. Zhu Mei, watch how you speak to Mr. Chen, the young man scolded. He then smiled with squinted eyes and said to Chen Pingan, Mr. Chen, you are more senior than I am, so this junior will listen to your teachings. I'll correct my mistakes and avoid making any new ones. Also, the person in your hand is Jiang Guanqing, the direct disciple of Sword Immortal Kuxia. Sword Immortal Kuxia is the martial nephew of one of the top 10 cultivators in our hometown, and this makes things very troublesome. Of course, I've admired Great Sword Immortals Wa, your senior brother, for a very long time already, and Great Sword Immortals Wa is also practicing sword techniques at the Sword Qi Great Wall right now. That being the case, I presume there won't be much to worry about. Even so, all of the sword immortals in the world are one big family, so it's ultimately not ideal to spoil the harmony. Are you a C observation tier sword cultivator? Are you the candidate for the first trial? Chen Pingan asked. The young man didn't answer this question, and he smiled faintly and asked, Mr. Chen, you hail from the eastern treasured Vial continent, so you are not going to man a trial for the sword cultivators of the Sword Qi Great Wall, right? As the two of them spoke, the young sword cultivator was using the official dialect of the majestic world, while Chen Pingan was using the local dialect of the Sword Qi Great Wall. The young man glanced down. Chen Pingan made a gentle pushing motion, sending the tall young man in his hand sprawling dozens of meters into the distance. Why are you so tall? You made me stand on my tippy toes for so long, he grumbled. He then looked at the interesting young man who was holding a pot of wine and continued, You already possess such a lofty cultivation base at such a young age, so if you continue to wander around and speak nonsense here, are you truly not afraid of scaring us to death? We're all weak and cowardly over here. Chen Sancho used the local dialect to translate their conversation for the wine shop's customers. There was jeering and whistling at the wine shop, and the alcoholics and single men squatting on the ground and drinking were extremely cooperative with the second shopkeeper. In the past, they had felt like the second shopkeeper was as miserly as could be. Compared to these brats from the Middle-earth divine continent, however, he was unexpectedly upright and graceful. They had truly misunderstood the second shopkeeper in the past, so perhaps they should take fewer pickled vegetables for free in the future? In any case, they always had a nagging feeling after the fact that it was difficult to get anything for free from the second shopkeeper, yet getting too many pickled vegetables for free actually encouraged them to drink more. Chen Pingan turned to the wine shop and asked with a smile, "How about I conduct this trial as a 4th-tier qi refiner? I'm also open to taking bets if you all wager on me losing." The customers in the wine shop all raised their middle fingers in response, not holding back at all as they chuckled and cursed. In fact, some of them immediately started cheering for the outsiders, claiming that the second shopkeeper wasn't actually good at anything except selling wine and writing couplets. If he truly got in a fight, he could be easily knocked down with 2 or 3 punches. What was there to be afraid of? They were outsider sword cultivators from the Middle-earth divine continent, so they needed to show some confidence and courage, especially since Chen Pingan was only from the measly eastern treasured vile continent. The customers also claimed that Raini, Puyu, Qishou and Pang Yuanji had purposely lost to that bastard, Chen Pingan, since they had accepted bets and wanted to make money. Thus, these outsider sword cultivators would do well to not believe these results. The young woman called Zhu Mei chuckled coldly and remarked, "So you're not only an alcoholic selling wine, but you're a gambling addict encouraging gambling as well." The scholarly sage was truly blind to accept you as a closing disciple. Chen Pingan smiled faintly and concurred. Drinking wine, betting money, and killing demons are indeed matters not worth mentioning in the eyes of cultivators from the Middle-earth divine continent. These are very lowly matters. Chan Sancho and the others immediately started loudly clapping and cheering, not forgetting to bang the tables or beat their chopsticks. Zhu Mei almost choked upon hearing this. Moreover, she even felt a slight sense of fear in the depths of her heart, seemingly as if she had mysteriously stepped into an unfamiliar small world. Even though Chen Pingan was standing quite far away from the sword cultivators of the Sword Qi Great Wall, this so-called closing disciple of the scholarly sage was seemingly resonating with the sword cultivators sitting or squatting behind him. "Do you know which part of that statement was unreasonable?" Chen Pingan asked with a smile. "Scholars in the majestic world indeed shouldn't drink and gamble, yet you were rendered speechless after I purposely included the notion of not killing demons. This is because you still have some conscience despite being a sword cultivator from the Middle-earth divine continent, and you sincerely feel like killing demons is a great feat. This is why you felt guilty and in the wrong. In reality, there's no need for you to feel this way. Principles and reasons need to be presented in an orderly, sequential manner, each on its own merit. Rights and wrongs shouldn't be cancelled out. For example, if you agree that killing demons is very correct, and has been correct for the past 10,000 years, and then you come here to debate me about alcoholism and gambling being extremely wrong, do you think I'll agree or disagree? What do you say? Those belonging to the scholarly sage's lineage have relatively good temper, and are even willing to speak reason, don't you think?" The young woman's thoughts were in complete disarray as she widened her eyes and stared at the alcoholic in azure. How were his bastardly explanations sounding somewhat reasonable? However, she couldn't help but feel angry just then. In the end, Chen Pingan turned to the young man, who was holding a wine pot but no longer smiling, and said, "Rest assured, I won't man the first trial as a 4th-tier qi refiner. Why, you ask? It's not that I don't want to teach you a lesson or teach you how to speak properly, but rather, I respect your willingness to travel to the Sword Qi Great Wall, even though you're sword cultivators from the Middle-earth divine continent. You're at least willing to take a look at the savage world. Outsiders needing to face the 3 trials is a public matter, so the personal grudges between us can be resolved at a later date." He returned to the wine shop. A man who was rapidly devouring pickled vegetables glanced over and exclaimed, "How impressive and imposing second shopkeeper! How about some free wine for the customers to celebrate?" Chen Pingan chuckled and replied, "Please know some shame, sword immortals, and please retract your sword qi as quickly as possible. Especially you, Yichuanjin. You eat 3 plates of pickled vegetables with each pot of wine. Do you think I'm not aware of this? I've already put up with you for a long time." The man picked up the half-eaten plate of pickled vegetables from the ground and proposed, "I'll give this back to you?" Chen Pingan was rendered speechless. Yichuanjin appeared extremely smug, as even he was afraid of his own shamelessness, so did he need to be afraid of the second shopkeeper? In any case, hadn't he learned this shamelessness from none other than the second shopkeeper? Chen Pingan cleared his throat, not sitting down as he clapped his hands and loudly announced, "Our wine shop is a small business, but we were still planning to act generously at our own expense, giving our customers a free bowl of yangchan noodles in addition to a free place of pickled vegetables with each pot of wine purchased." Looking at the situation now, however, It's best that I forget about this. Yangchun noodles can't be regarded as a delicacy anyway. With the soup clear and bland, the noodles are simply a bit chewier, and the soup simply has a few more specks of spring onion. Pouring the small plate of pickled vegetables into the noodles and mixing everything together. The taste is actually just so. Yi Chuanjin was instantly subject to dagger-like glares from the alcoholics around him. Everyone was aware that they couldn't defeat the second shopkeeper in a debate of reason. Yi Chuanjin gritted his teeth and said, "Give me a pot of fine wine, second shopkeeper, the type that costs 5 snowflake coins each. I accidentally ate a bit too many pickled vegetables today, and I'm feeling a bit thirsty from all the sodium. I need to drink some wine to quench my thirst." "Coming right up, Brother Yi." Chen Pingan giddily ran into the wine shop to grab a pot of fine wine, not forgetting to glance back and announce with a smile, "We'll start offering Yangchun noodles 2 days from now." Jiang Guanqing, the young man carrying a sword on his back, had already been helped up, and he looked much better than before after expelling the fist intent and astral energy using his sword qi. "Yin Lu, are you okay?" Zhu Mei asked in a soft voice. Yin Lu, the young man holding a wine pot, nodded lightly and replied with a smile, "Why would I not be okay? I would only suffer if he seized this opportunity to conduct the first trial. Junbai would scold me to death." Junbai warned us not to wander outside for no reason after arriving at Sword Immortal Sun's residence. So why did you give Jiang Guanqing a free rein to cause trouble here? Zhu Mei grumbled in a quiet voice. The young man wearing a simple and elegant robe turned around to glance at the wine shop before quickly retracting his gaze. He didn't like this type of chaotic atmosphere. In fact, he detested it. These people were cultivators, yet they didn't maintain a clean and virtuous life, nor did they possess any immortal aura expected of cultivators from the mountains. Yin Lu raised the pot of azure divine mountain wine in his hand and replied with a smile, "I'm just trying to find out whether this immortal wine truly has a relationship with the azure divine mountain. My old ancestor always attends the azure divine banquet hosted in the Bamboo Sea Small World." Zhu Mei rolled her eyes and said, "All right, we all know that you love to bring up your family history and announce to the entire world how wealthy your old ancestor is. Jiang Guanqing's clan and cultivation lineage isn't any inferior to yours, but have you ever seen him boasting about his uncle master? It's just that he's not the sharpest tool in the shed, always mistaking wind for rain. He never thinks before he acts, and he likes to flare up in rage at the slightest of offenses. Does he think we're still in the Middle Earth Divine Continent? Before coming to the Sword Qi Great Wall, my old ancestor warned me about many things, telling me not to act haughtily here and instead pretend to be deaf and mute. Sai, forget about it, I don't have the right to talk about these things either. I already spoke a lot just then. Let's get this straight first, you're not allowed to tell Junbai about this, and he simply needs to know that I remained silent from the beginning to the end. Junbai is only at the sea observation tier, but he's truly terrifying when he becomes angry. I fare okay, especially since my cultivation base isn't high to begin with. But what about you and the others? You also become as silent and fearful as me." Yin Lu's expression became slightly unnatural. If it weren't for one of Zhu Mei's clan elders being the mountain master of a Confucian academy in the Flowing Dawn continent, and her supposedly possessing a rich fortune from a young age and having signed a strange contract with a mountain goddess of their empire, then Yin Lu truly wanted to give her a nice big slap across the face. He would make her remember this lesson and speak like a human in the future, rather than driving a blade through his heart with each sentence that she uttered at the wine shop. It was also Dai Zhang's first time hearing about Chen Pingan's proposal to offer a bowl of Yangchun noodles for free with each purchase of a pot of wine. After Chen Pingan sat down, she said to him in a quiet voice, "I need to manage the business and I'll also need to make Yangchun noodles in the future, so I'm afraid that I won't be able to manage all this by myself." Chen Pingan smiled and replied, "I've heard that the father of Kangol, that little boy, is quite a good cook and a fairly decent person as well. Even so, he's struggled to find a stable job over the past few years. I'll teach him a secret recipe for making Yangchun noodles afterward, and he can become a long-term employee of our wine shop. Zhang Jiazhen can also work here as a part-time employee whenever he has spare time, and he can help around with the miscellaneous tasks and whatnot. That way shopkeeper Dai can get some rest. In any case, their salary over a year won't even add up to the cost of a single bowl of wine." Dai Zhang smiled and nodded in response, appearing just as exuberantly happy as when she earned money. Chen Sanxiu Fatty Yen, and the others were already accustomed to this. These were the kinds of things that Chen Pingan would consider and act upon. However, Fandach felt slightly puzzled as he asked in a joking manner, Chen Pingan, don't you find this troublesome? How have you achieved your current cultivation? Did it fall from the skies? Hey Dach, Chen Pingan called out. What's up? Fandach asked in a slightly nervous voice. You're drinking together with so many Golden Core tier seniors, and this small table is occupied by Sanxiu, Fatty Yen, Dong Huafu, and Daizhong. Just how much face are they giving you? Yet, everyone here is drinking the cheapest wine. This doesn't seem very appropriate, Chen Pingan said in a persuading voice. Fandach wasn't very willing to get ripped off, especially since there was still a 4th-tier qi refiner at the table. If my observation and guess are correct, then that young man holding a pot of wine just then is most likely responsible for the second trial. He's also at the Dragon Gate tier, but just how old is he? How humiliating would it be for you to lose? Chen Pingan continued in a quiet voice. Hearing this, Fandach asked shopkeeper Daizhong for a pot of fine wine. However, he couldn't help but ask, why are you so certain that there'll be a second trial? Chen Pingan thought for a moment before explaining. Things would have been more difficult to guess if Sword Immortal Gua hadn't grounded Lu Duan. Now, however, there will definitely be a second trial. The reason for this is very simple. Sword cultivators from the Middle-earth Divine Continent care most about their face. If everything proceeds smoothly, then the Sea Observation Tier cultivator responsible for holding the first trial will be Gao Yeho's younger sister, Gao Yuqing, correct? She's only ascended the city wall one time, and she's never been to the battlefield in the south. Gao Yuqing's aptitude is naturally very good, and in terms of combat experience and the destructive ability of one's flying sword alone, Golden Core tier sword cultivators from the Sword Qi Great Wall are far superior to their counterparts in the majestic world. They naturally possess a noticeable advantage under the Golden Core tier as well, but this advantage isn't as big as you might think. In any case, there are many prodigies in the Middle-earth Divine Continent, and even though Jiang Guanqing belongs to the Grand Disciple generation of one of the 10 most powerful cultivators in the Middle-earth Divine Continent, and despite his master, Sword Immortal Ku Xia, traveling with them, he still doesn't have much influence in the group of young prodigies. Taking this into account, Gao Yuqing will lose in the first trial. That young man holding the pot of wine clearly isn't the leader of the group either. When I attacked Jiang Guanqing earlier, his companions were all extremely worried and instinctively wanted to help. Even so, not all of them looked to Yen Lu for his opinion and instructions. From this, we can deduce that Yen Lu is nowhere near winning over his companions and becoming their leader. Since he isn't the leader, would he dare to step forward and gamble with the face of all of the sword cultivators in the Middle-earth Divine Continent, recklessly participating in the 3 trials? There's definitely someone else in Sword Immortal Sun's residence, a leader whom they all accept and listen to. I surmise that this person is an extraordinary prodigy who's young, has a low cultivation base, but possesses outstanding combat power. Just how incredible is this person? They're so incredible that even the young prodigies who are 1 to 2 cultivation bases above them are willing to listen to them. In other words, this person is undoubtedly the mastermind behind the announcement, placing additional rules on the 3 trials. Sword Immortal Ku Xia has already visited the Sword Qi Great Wall before, so he wouldn't be so bored as to come up with these ideas. That nascent tier Sword Immortal would be even less daring to do something like this. To put things bluntly, can these young masters and young mistresses truly be protected by just a nascent tier cultivator? With this in mind, we can indirectly infer that the young sword cultivator possesses an excellent mind, able to exert influence over both a senior nascent tier cultivator and a sword immortal. Fandach was astounded by what he heard, and he exclaimed, Chen Pingan, were you already aware of these people's identities and backgrounds beforehand? Or did the Ning residents receive some news from Stalactite Mountain? Why don't you guess? Chen Pingan replied with a wide grin. Daizhong rolled her eyes, wanting to remind Fandach that he definitely shouldn't guess. That would be mentally exhausting. Many people are placing bets on this, so our plan is? Yinzhua asked. Chen Pingan shook his head and said, making money by betting on us losing would be quite vexing. Based on this statement alone, this pot of wine was well worth the money, Fandach said as he handed over a wine bowl. You borrowed the money from me anyway, Chen Sancho added. Not bad, Fandach, not bad at all. You're starting to learn from Dong Huafu, Yinjue praised. Dong Huafu shook his head and commented, he still isn't as good as me. Fandach raised his wine bowl and said with a wide smile, then a toast. They all raised their wine bowls and downed their wine. Chen Pingan came across a man wearing Confucian robes when he returned to the Ning residence by himself. This person was none other than noble scholar Wang Zhai. Wang Zhai spoke briefly and succinctly, asking some questions about sword cultivator Huang Zhou, and discussing the official inspection process at the Sword Qi Great Wall with Chen Pingan. Simply put, the two sword immortals belonging to the hidden official's lineage were unwilling to look too deeply into Huang Zhou's death, even though they were explicitly responsible for these kinds of matters. Moreover, there was no conclusion on whether Huang Zhou was a spy working for the demon tribe. At the very least, there wasn't any concrete evidence. Due to these factors, Chen Pingan could escape punishment for killing Huang Zhou. However, the hidden official's lineage definitely wouldn't help Chen Pingan prove his innocence, nor would Wang Zhai. Chen Pingan would need to deal with any future criticisms himself. In the end, Wang Zhai stated that he would tie up the loose ends in the alley where Huang Zhou resided, providing some funds to support the elderly and youth. This only required some minor effort. Why are you being so impartial? Chen Pingan asked in curiosity. My master is good friends with Mr. Mao, and the two of them once traveled and pursued knowledge together. My master has always regarded Mr. Mao not being able to temper his knowledge at the School of Rites as a great shame, Wang Zhai replied using his mind's lake. Chen Pingan came to a realization, and he cupped his fists and bowed in response. Wang Zhai had no option but to return the gesture. In reality, this wasn't very appropriate, but given that his earlier intentions and actions might not have escaped the attention of the hidden official, as well as Sword Immortal Zhuan and Sword Immortal Luo Shan, returning this gesture wouldn't matter anymore. Wang Zhai suddenly smiled and said, Mr. Chen, I heard that you personally composed and bound a book called the Seal Manual of the 100 Sword Immortals, with one of the seals having the inscription, the sun shines bright during daytime, as the moon glows radiant during nighttime. I have a good friend who has the character Bright in his name, so this would be a perfect gift for him. Noble scholar Wang Zhai didn't feel awkward at all about referring to the young man as Mr. Chen. I'll give Yinjue a heads up, Chen Pingan replied with a smile. Mr. Wang, you can feel free to collect the seal yourself if you don't mind the feminine atmosphere of the silk shop. If this is too troublesome, then I can arrange for someone to deliver the seal to your study. This won't require any effort. Wang Zhai smiled and nodded in response, saying, Thank you for your help, Mr. Chen. It would be even better if there were a side inscription and signature. That's as easy as lifting a finger, Chen Pingan replied. Do you know why I'm willing to do this? Wang Zhai asked. After all, it would have been completely sufficient for me to remain silent, and I would have had a clear conscience even taking into account the friendship between my master and Mr. Mao. I don't know, Chen Pingan replied with a shake of his head. Not knowing is good. Very good, Wang Zhai remarked with a sigh of emotion. He bade farewell and took his leave, with his Confucian robes flowing in the wind. Chen Pingan returned to the Ning residence, standing on the training ground for a brief moment and looking at Ning Yao cultivating in the pavilion. She was like a beautiful painting, even from far away, one that could bring joy and relaxation to one's mind. He returned to the small wing room afterward, continuing to craft and inscribe seals. He would definitely recompile and rebind the currently crude seal manual of the 100 Sword Immortals in the future. After all, this manual didn't truly contain just 100 seals. The 100 or so seals that had initially been on the small table had already been grabbed by Yinjue and brought to his silk shop. They were now being treated as treasures of the shop. Most of the seals currently on the table were uninscribed, with only a very small number of them having complete inscriptions. To Chen Pingan, inscribing seals was not only a way to calm his mind but also to review his knowledge. In addition, how could he summarize his knowledge in a few characters or a dozen or so characters and give them away with the seals, which were simply crafted from ordinary material? And how could he encourage people to voluntarily and happily take these seals, perhaps even going as far as to pay for them? Was this a small task? No, it was actually a major task. Looking back at the history of the Sword Qi Great Wall, Many sages, noble scholars, and virtuous scholars from the lineages of the etiquette sage and the second sage had come and gone. In fact, some of them had even died on the battlefield to the south. Did these scholars, who possessed auras of justice and righteousness, not want to hear the sound of sagely scriptures being loudly recited at the Sword Chi Great Wall? However, they each had their own hardships, challenges, and shackles, ultimately preventing them from truly promoting the teachings of Confucianism. Of course, Chen Pingan didn't think that he was capable of picking up this mantle, and he was simply doing what he could. Chen Pingan held a carving knife and slowly inscribed seal script characters onto a seal. Observing Dao Temple, Dao observing Dao. Chen Pingan initially hadn't wanted to make custom seals for Dong Buet and her friends, but he had agreed to her request after seeing Ning Yao nod in approval. It wasn't the case that he could completely ignore some matters simply because he was aloof to them. Of course, Dong Buet purposely making this request of Chen Pingan in front of Ning Yao was also a reflection of her cleverness. The characters inscribed on the fine jade seals were straight and proper, with Chen Pingan placing extra emphasis on elegance and scholarly aura. Since this was a legitimate sale, Chen Pingan would make a fair deal with everyone regardless of age or gender. When they drank at the wine shop before, Dong Huafu said his older sister quite liked the seals, so she could help promote them in the future and attract more customers. However, the condition was that she received a share of the profits from Chen Pingan. Chen Pingan politely declined this offer, and Dong Huafu didn't mind this decision. He hadn't wanted his older sister to visit the Ning residence so frequently anyway, lest it give rise to vulgar rumors. If that were the case, then Chen Pingan would be the first to suffer, and Dong Huafu would ultimately suffer the most. After all, if Chen Pingan were scolded by big sister Ning, who would he vent his anger on if not Dong Huafu? He was well aware of how Chen Pingan had dealt with Fan Dach, and Fan Dach had even felt quite happy after being beaten up by Chen Pingan. Perhaps Fan Dach was stupid, but he most certainly wasn't. Dong Buet was indeed the direct daughter of the Dong clan, and both she and her friends were very generous, upholding their promise and giving the leftover jade materials to Chen Pingan as payment for his carving and inscriptions. Meanwhile, Chen Pingan genuinely turned the leftover materials into extremely small seals, crafting a dozen or so and choosing to inscribe each seal with dense arrays of characters. In fact, one seal was inscribed with more than 100 characters. These small seals weren't crafted from ordinary jade. The jade provided by Dong Buet and her friends was frost jade, a jade extremely famous among immortal materials. In addition, Chen Pingan had needed to employ 15th to inscribe the minuscule characters on the seal. He wouldn't offer these small seals as gifts for placing a deposit with the silk shop. Instead, he would sell them for one lesser heat coin. Bargaining wouldn't be allowed, and the customers could either pay up or leave. Perhaps the wealthy women who visited the silk shop at the Sword Chi Great Wall wouldn't be able to understand the amazing nature of the inscriptions, so the seal, which seemingly had the same characters, observing Dao, repeated 3 times, would most likely gather dust for a long time. Chen Pingan picked up another blank seal, inscribing the characters. A perfect union under the moon and flowers, a couple as perfect as immortals. Chen Pingan shook the seal and blew over it, after which he weighed it in his palm with a look of satisfaction. With his exquisite craftwork and the auspicious inscription, he would change his surname if people didn't fight over this seal. Business at the silk shop couldn't rely solely on female customers, and they needed to attract male customers as well. That would be a reflection of his abilities as the second shopkeeper of the shop. And thus, Chen Pingan whistled softly as he briefly contemplated this matter, after which he unhurriedly retrieved another blank seal and inscribed the characters. There lives a woman so beautiful that she put to shame the 3 lamps in the heavens. Over at Sword Immortal Sun Jiyuan's residence, Zhu Mei and Jiang Guanqing were standing with their heads bowed outside a pavilion, and Yen Lu and the others didn't dare to smile as they stood nearby. Inside the pavilion was Lin Junbai, a young man currently studying a Go manual by himself. He always carried his beloved Go boards and Go stone containers with him, with all of these items being top-notch immortal treasures. It was said that these treasures had initially belonged to White Emperor City, and they had only made their way to Lin Junbai's hands afterward. 2 of the Go containers were decorated with the phrases, "always watched over by the deities," and "always protected by the heavens." And the many Go stones on the Go board appeared like dazzling sword light from 2 swords, each exuding sword chi of a different color. There was a standoff on the Go board, and sword chi clashed above it. Every time Lin Junbai picked up a Go stone and placed it on the Go board. His very act of avoiding the crisscrossing sword chi was dizzying and profound. In reality, Lin Junbai hadn't scolded the two people just then, simply listening to their explanation and asking them a few questions about the details. However, Zhu Mei and Jiang Guanqing were quite nervous and scared. It was difficult to imagine that Lin Junbai was actually a vagrant cultivator, especially since his achievements over the past few years were far too incredible, so much so that people could very easily forget his humble beginnings from the mortal streets and alleys. Lin Junbai glanced at the Go board before looking at the Go manual resting beside his hand. He then turned to his companions and said with a smile, "There's no need to feel so tense. The situation is unchanged, so you can all go back and cultivate." 3 of them would face the 3 trials in 3 days' time. Lin Junbai then called one of them back and proposed, "Senior brother Bianjing, how about a game of Go?" The young man who had visited the wine shop with Yen Lu and the others nodded in response before walking into the pavilion and sitting down. Over at the wine shop, he had seemingly reacted the slowest following Chen Pingan's attack on Jiang Guanqing. However, things were completely different now, and the young sword cultivator called Bianjing appeared relaxed and lazy as he pulled a Go contained over and rested his cheek in his hand. He helped Lin Junbai clean up the Go board, not avoiding the crisscrossing sword chi like Lin Junbai, but instead choosing to forcefully shatter them as he picked up the Go stones and returned them to their containers. Lin Junbai was just about to say something, but Bianjing spoke up first, grumbling, "You've already mentioned this 2 times. Is my memory that bad? I just need to fake a loss to that situation, right? Otherwise, the sword chi Great Wall will lose face, and that will cause us endless trouble in the future, inevitably affecting the peaceful cultivation of Yen Lu and Zhu Mei." "Everything is fine as long as you understand," Lin Junbai replied with a smile. "There's no doubt that you'll win the first battle. But are you confident about Yen Lu winning the second battle?" Bianjing asked. "There's a chance, but not a very big one," Lin Junbai replied. "Everything would have gone smoothly if you, senior brother, were still at the Dragon Gate tier, and I surmise that the sword cultivators at the Sword Chi Great Wall wouldn't have felt confident enough to cause us trouble after losing the 2 trials. So it's my fault for being fortunate and advancing too quickly?" Bianjing asked teasingly. This golden core tier sword cultivator, Bianjing, was the only sword cultivator among them who didn't belong to the Shaoyuan Empire. He looked to be in his 20s, but he was actually in his 30s. Even so, reaching the peak stage of the golden core tier in his 30s was already an extraordinary feat. Lin Junbai's master was the imperial preceptor of the 6th largest empire in the majestic world, and Bianjing was an unofficial disciple of his. Lin Junbai didn't know much about the true background of this little-known sword cultivator who was supposedly at the sea observation tier, and his master wasn't willing to reveal too much either. Only sword immortal Kuxia had noticed some clues during their trip to Stalactite Mountain, and even the elderly nascent tier cultivator was in the dark regarding Bianjing's true cultivation base. As for Yen Lu and the others, they were even more oblivious to the fact that a flood dragon was swimming beside them, happy to watch them for jokes and entertainment. If Lin Junbai's greatest interest was to find someone to play Go with, and to witness great sword immortals will use sword techniques during his training at the Sword Chi Great Wall, then his half-senior brother, Bianjing, was definitely gunning for sword immortal Wei Jing, the most talented swordsman in the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. In any case, senior brother Bianjing appeared to be quite fortunate at Stalactite Mountain's Plum Blossom Garden, getting along very well with the woman who was responsible for overseeing the courtyard. Over in their hometown, the Shaoyuan Empire, Bianjing was still like a fish in water, even though he was only a so-called sea observation tier cultivator, and at most only enjoyed the status of being the imperial preceptor's unofficial disciple. He enjoyed many fated opportunities, and even Lin Junbai would sometimes suspect whether Bianjing was a fabled otherworldly immortal who had been born with great intelligence. "I've heard that Chen Pingan owns a celestial tool, but he didn't summon this celestial tool even during his intense battle with Peng Yuanji. How would you fare against Chen Pingan?" Lin Junbai asked. Bianjing placed a Go stone on the board before using 2 fingers to casually drag the incredibly precious white stone around, seemingly squabbling with the stone. "Our focus should be cultivation, so it's fairly pointless to fight with other people for the sake of so-called victory or defeat," he replied in a casual voice. Lin Junbai smiled faintly and grabbed a handful of go stones, saying, "Let's decide who goes first?" Bianjing was in no hurry to start the go game, and he looked up and asked, "You already know about that?" Lin Junbai nodded and replied, "You were clearly wounded when you returned, but you were smiling more than normal and speaking louder than normal. I was able to make a guess because of that." Bianjing sighed in grief and lamented, "But my opponent was Chao Ci. Losing to him isn't embarrassing, is it?" Lin Junbai nodded and concurred. Losing to Chao Ci isn't embarrassing. In my opinion, however, voluntarily running over to ask for a beating isn't exactly smart. Bianjing fell silent. "How many punches?" Lin Junbai asked in curiosity. Bianjing tilted his chin and pointed at his 2 fingers resting on the white go stone. "A single punch?" Lin Junbai asked in puzzlement. Bianjing chuckled in anger and exclaimed, "2 punches. His first punch defeated my flying sword, and his second punch left me confused and sorry. Truth be told, I could have withstood a few more punches if I were shameless enough." Lin Junbai smiled and didn't say anything else. "Do you not have any additional plans given that it's not a certainty for Yan Lu to achieve victory?" Bianjing asked. "I initially had a plan, and I would have directly broken through on the spot if the Sword Qi Great Wall sent Guozhuzhou to conduct the second trial," Lin Junbai replied. "Afterward, I would have broken through again if they sent Gao Yeho or Situ Weiran to conduct the third trial. However, I changed my mind after settling down here. There's no need for me to do this, and acting this way would only benefit others. For example, there would definitely be a 4th trial if Chen Pingan is present. I'm not you after all, and I would definitely lose to Chen Pingan, who also fought 4 battles. That would only boost Chen Pingan's reputation." "You care that much about Chen Pingan? Did Zhu Mei and the others suffer at the wine shop because of your intentional plans?" Bianjing asked in amusement. "Chen Pingan should be happy that I'm paying any heed to him," Lin Junbai replied with a faint smile. "Die." Chen Pingan, the young man who was oblivious to Lin Junbai's care for him, was starting to refine his 4th bonded item inside a secret room at the Ning residence. A water seal in his water palace, the 5-colored soil in his mountain shrine, a deity statue in his wood residence, and now a bonded item of the metal element. Following this, the final bonded item would need to be of the fire element, something that he had yet to find. Chen Pingan had refined the water seal atop the Sea of Clouds at Old Dragon City, the southernmost point of the eastern treasured Vile continent. He had refined the 5-colored soil near the area where the Plenty River flowed into the sea in the northern complete reed continent. He had refined the wooden deity statue, which he had obtained from a mountaintop Taoist temple in the ruins of an immortal abode, on an island in the Dragon Palace small world. And now he was about to refine a bonded item of the metal element, a golden page with golden characters. To be more precise, this page was an entire Buddhist scripture. Chen Pingan had asked senior brothers Wu Yu about his plan before, and the latter had simply replied, "A noble person isn't a tool, so what's wrong with refining this item?" The cauldron he used was still the 5-colored golden box cauldron that he had obtained from Lu Yong, the elderly nascent tier cultivator from the Parasol Leaf continent. It was extremely high grade, but because of his relationship with Zhang Shangzhen, the cauldron had been half sold and half gifted to him, costing only 50 grain rain coins. Lu Yong had once stated that the metal element had everlasting and imperishable property, so this pill refinement cauldron was actually most suitable for refining metals, one of the 5 elements. A large number of natural treasures had been suitably prepared in the secret room. Nalin Yeshing was sitting cross-legged outside the secret room, responsible for looking after Chen Pingan's safety. Grandma Bai was chatting with Ning Yao in the pavilion at Dragon Slaying Cliff. The old woman smiled and said in reassurance, "You don't need to worry. Fortune favors the good, and the Ning residence's son-in-law is an upright person, so he'll definitely receive the blessings of the heavens. In any case, he's incredibly knowledgeable, and he's traveled far and wide and performed many benevolent deeds in the world, even though he's a Confucian disciple. Young mistress, you don't need to worry about his refinement of the bonded item." Even so, Ning Yao couldn't help but feel slightly anxious, but she still smiled and replied, "Grandma Bai, don't say these things in front of Chen Pingan. It will make him feel uncomfortable." "You mean referring to him as the Ning residence's son-in-law?" Grandma Bai asked on purpose. Chen Pingan only appears uncomfortable on the surface, but he's actually feeling as delighted as can be. 2. Ningyao felt slightly more relaxed after this light-hearted change in topic, and she smiled and said, "If his refinement is successful, then I'll accompany him to watch the 3 trials in 2 days' time." "You were never interested in these matters in the past," Grandma Bai commented. "I'm still not interested in these matters, and I'll only be accompanying him to help him relax," Ningyao replied. After falling silent for a moment, she added, "You might not have noticed, but Chen Pingan will face the most difficulty when refining his bonded item of the metal element." "Difficult on the mind or physically difficult to overcome the challenge?" the old woman asked. "Both," Ningyao replied. Grandma Bai suddenly grew worried, even more so than her young mistress. Ningyao smiled and said, "It's okay, Grandma Bai, there won't be any problems. Chen Pingan is always able to overcome challenges by himself. It's always been like this. In fact, he'll only feel worried if he knows that we're feeling anxious. Otherwise." Ningyao looked at the training ground beyond the pavilion and continued, "There's no hardship that he can't defeat and push through." "That's good then," Grandma Bai replied with a nod. Ningyao retrieved a seal from her sleeve and handed it to Grandma Bai, saying in a soft voice, "I stole this from his collection." Grandma Bai didn't know whether to laugh or to cry, and she looked at the inscription on the seal before falling into a daze. She carefully placed the seal inside her sleeve, unable to contain her smile as she remarked, "Chen Pingan's inscriptions are truly beautiful." The seal script inscriptions were especially comforting. Her black hair frosted with snow, yet she remains as beautiful as always. Ningyao shook her head and said, "He said himself that his handwriting is extremely proper and dull. Apart from his regular script being okay, he's only a novice in semi-cursive, cursive, and seal scripts. Masters of calligraphy will only see his handwriting as a joke. However, it's more than enough to inscribe characters on these seals made from ordinary materials." Meanwhile, Nalin Yeshing felt slightly puzzled as he stood outside the secret room. 2 hours had already passed, so why was Chen Pingan yet to light the cauldron? Inside the secret room, Chen Pingan sat with his eyes closed the entire time, completely lost in thought. Die. Fatty Yen felt extremely uneasy as he sat inside the extravagant residence of the Yen clan, which might as well have been plastered with the characters, "This clan is rich," all over the walls. He had excitedly returned home after obtaining that seal, yet he had surprisingly started to feel troubled after arriving, not daring to take it out at all. Thus, the matter was indefinitely delayed. Today, he hesitantly paced back and forth in the corridor outside his father's study. There was no door on the study room, allowing his father, the clan leader of the Yen clan, to more easily enter and exit. In reality, there was no need to do this, but Yenjua's father had made this decision himself. He had removed the door to the study room, saying that it should be accepted that his arms were gone. Why would he open and close the door using sword qi? For fun. Yan Ming had noticed his son pacing around the corridor from the very beginning, what with his son being so fat and causing the entire earth to shudder as he walked. Yan Ming was still at the nascent tier regardless of how much his cultivation base had fallen, so how could he not have noticed this? He frowned and said, "Hurry up and scram if you're not going to come in." Yenjua still felt extreme respect and fear toward his father, and this couldn't be helped, considering how he had been disciplined and beaten as a child. Afterward, his father had most likely given up on him, not even bothering to hit or scold his only son. Only after he had to carry Yenjua home from the city wall that time did his attitude toward Yenjua become slightly better, occasionally asking about his progress in cultivation. Afterward, Yenjua's mother, whose greatest ability had been to spoil him, had seemingly been told by her husband to make a change. And thus she surprisingly became stricter with Yenjua, regardless of whether it pertained to cultivation, business, or making friends. Yenjua was just about to heed his father's advice and piss off, but after taking a few steps, he gritted his teeth and turned around, making his way inside the study room. Yan Ming looked like a solemn, dignified middle-aged man, with his sleeves empty as he remained seated in his chair. Stacks of books rested on the table in front of him, and there was a small spirit responsible for flipping the pages. Yan Ming furrowed his brow and asked, "Is something the matter?" Yenjua timidly retrieved the seal and gently placed it on the table, saying, This is a gift for you, Dad. I'll take my leave if there are no other matters. Yan Ming faltered for a moment, looking at the seal made from ordinary material and asking, Are you running out of money? Is that why you're giving me this? Yan Zhuo flushed bright red, and he didn't even dare to explain himself as he looked down and quickly walked away, leaving the study. He felt a great sense of relief after leaving the corridor. Inside the study, the obedient and clever little spirit skipped over to the seal and squatted down, pushing the seal over and revealing its inscriptions to its master. Yan Ming looked at it for a long time before suddenly asking, Say, have I been too strict on Zhuer? The little spirit nodded vigorously. Yan Ming chuckled, turning around and looking outside the window at the tall city in the distance. I dare not ascend the city wall with my sword, lest I frighten away the 3 moons. How can your dad possibly be so powerful? The little spirit blinked its eyes. It had diligently served its master for a great number of years, yet it had never seen its master smile so widely before. Above the city wall, noble scholar Wang Zhai had just given a newly printed copy of the seal manual of the 100 Sword Immortals to Yi Laolian, the Confucian sage overseeing the Sword Qi Great Wall. The book was extremely crude, completely unable to compare with ordinary books printed in the majestic world, to say nothing of the exquisite books collected by the scholarly clans. The sage flicked through the seal manual, giving a knowing smile whenever he saw something that resonated with him. No scenic spots or natural landscapes present, but the tallest city in the world, where children play when sword immortals drink. After reaching a certain page, the Confucian sage stopped flipping and nodded lightly. Wang Zhai looked over and saw the phrase, Frost descends, thus only 300 persimmons can be harvested. He also smiled, remarking, Speaking at this moment, perhaps no one else in the Sword Qi Great Wall can appreciate this amusing phrase. Confucian sage Yi Laolian smiled and said, Then perhaps there's a possibility that someone with both time and money will purchase books to scour through them and look for the origin of these inscriptions. Just like the Eastern treasured Vile Continent's luminous Vermilion Empire, there were also many sword cultivators in the Middle Earth Divine Continent's Shaoyuan Empire. Thus there was a sea of people spectating the 3 trials today. The location for the 3 trials was Ink Stick Street, a street filled with renowned families and wealthy clans. It wasn't held on Taixiang Street, where the clans of Chen Sanqiu and Dong Huafu were located, because they didn't dare to. Even if they dared to conduct the trials on Taixiang Street, it was very likely that no one would dare to head over to spectate. Fatty Yen stood on his tippy toes and looked around, asking in puzzlement, Why hasn't Brother Chan come yet? Dong Huafu was chomping down on a large pancake, and this young master of the Dong clan always bought things on Chan Sanqiu and Yen Zhuo's dime. Fan Dach glanced at the entrance of a clan residence nearby, and Chan Sanqiu patted his shoulder to comfort him. Fan Dach smiled and said, It's okay. Standing on the 2 ends of the street were a group of local sword cultivators led by Qi Shou and Gao Yeho, as well as a group of outsider sword cultivators, including Yen Lu and Jiang Guanqing. The young Lin Junbai was like a bright moon nestled among a sea of stars, while Bian Jing still remained the most unremarkable person in the group. Gao Yuqing, Gao Yeho's little sister, was responsible for conducting the first trial, so Gao Yeho was naturally present this time, having not attended last time to spectate Chen Pingan's trials. Peng Yuanji was standing beside Gao Yeho, and he was currently giving pointers to the relatively short Gao Yuqing. It wasn't that Gao Yeho didn't want to take responsibility for this, but his little sister had never liked listening to his rambling. Lin Junbai slowly walked forward, while Gao Yuqing confidently strode over. The 2 of them approached each other, with neither showing any intention of summoning their flying sword. A group of Earth Immortal sword cultivators was squatting on the steps in front of a residence as they smiled and teased. Little Gao, your opponent is truly handsome and more than worthy enough of you. Once you defeat him, you can sling him across your shoulder and find a quiet place to do whatever you want. Gao Yuqing paid no heed to them, completely focused and in the zone as she looked intently at the approaching young man. Lin Junbai surprisingly had the leisure to look around and size up the extravagant residences on both sides of Ink Stick Street. The 2 sea observation tier sword cultivators ended their battle with a single exchange. Gao Yuqing was the first to unleash her flying sword, which sliced through the air and disappeared in an instant, not seeking to be loud or flashy. Lin Junbai released his flying sword later, yet it arrived at its destination first, not only parrying Gao Youqing's bonded flying sword with ease, but also instantly arriving inches away from Gao Youqing's glabella. Gao Youqing's face became deathly pale. The flying sword hovering in front of her glabella vanished as quickly as it had arrived, with Lin Junbai also turning around and returning to the other end of the street. Yen Lu took a deep breath and stepped forward, brushing past Lin Junbai as he advanced. Lin Junbai smiled faintly at him and said, "You can try to extend this battle a bit more." Yen Lu nodded firmly in response. There was a large number of spectating sword cultivators standing on the two sides of the street, but none of them booed or cursed the outsiders following the conclusion of the first trial. Deciding victory and defeat in an instant was a reflection of the young man's strength. However, that young man was far too punchable, so much so that he was almost catching up to the second shopkeeper. And with this thought in mind, they willed the second shopkeeper into existence. Chen Pingan walked over with Ning Yao, coincidentally appearing from the end of the street where Lin Junbai and the others were standing. Lin Junbai looked at the young man in azure who was slightly pale and seemingly sick, smiling before quickly shifting his gaze to the young woman standing beside him. She was apparently even more powerful and impressive, with countless people singing her praises. In fact, Lin Junbai had heard many praises for her, while staying at Stalactite Mountain's Plum Blossom Garden. However, was there anything impressive about advancing to the sea observation tier before 10 years old? She was in her 20s, but she was only at the peak stage of the Golden Core tier and yet to advance to the nascent tier. No? As such, she wasn't anywhere near shockingly impressive or peerless, was she? Lin Junbai shook his head and took a few extra glances at her, not even thinking that she was especially beautiful. She was far inferior to his expectations of the Sword Chi Great Wall's Ning Yao. Chen Pingan placed his hands inside his opposite sleeves and slowly walked forward, glancing back at Lin Junbai and saying with a smile, "Watch your eyes." The sound of whistling instantly filled the street. Those at the Sword Chi Great Wall never held back when it came to poking fun at their own. This was especially the case since the second shopkeeper wasn't a young girl like Gao Youqing, instead being a shameless person who was even more unconscionable in business than in fights. "Are you talking about yourself?" Lin Junbai retorted with a faint smile. Chen Pingan didn't look at Lin Junbai after issuing his warning, and he instead looked at Bianjing, who was hiding in the crowd. Bianjing's expression remained calm, but he couldn't help but grumble in his mind. Had he given away some clues at the wine shop before? Surely not, right? Ning Yao tugged Chen Pingan's sleeve, following which he stopped and asked in a gentle voice, "What's the matter?" Ning Yao continued to look at him. Chen Pingan smiled and nodded in response. And thus Ning Yao turned to Lin Junbai and said, "He told you to watch your eyes, so just keep quiet and watch your eyes." Lin Junbai pursed his lips. And then Ning Yao said something else, causing the entire street to instantly fall silent. Chan Sanqiu and Yen Zhuo exchanged a glance, detecting the feeling of pity in each other's eyes. They struggled to contain their laughter. Not only that, but many sword immortals who were responsible for guarding the city wall directly rushed over on their swords, not even going to the trouble of using their immortal observation techniques. This was because Ning Yao had said, "If you dare to break through on the spot and unleash a Dragon Gate tier sword strike, then I'll suppress my cultivation base to the sea observation tier and face you. If you dare to break through again and unleash a Golden Core tier sword strike, then I'll suppress my cultivation base to the Dragon Gate tier and face you. Do you want to admit defeat now?" Cultivators didn't like to leave things to chance. Lin Junbai especially disliked unexpected things happening around him. 3 days ago, Yen Lu, Zhu Mei, Jiang Guanqing, and Bianjing's visit to the wine shop wasn't by accident. Rather, it had been by his design. Yen Lu's old ancestor was familiar with those in the Bamboo Sea small world, while Yen Lu himself liked to hide daggers behind his smile. He was a relatively somber person who liked to cause trouble and exacerbate issues. Zhu Mei's uncle master had suffered greatly at the hands of sword immortals Wei Yu, with his innate sword aptitude being shattered by the sword immortal many years ago. Zhu Mei was also strongly influenced by the second sage's teachings, and she was extremely fond of standing up against injustice, speaking frankly and without hesitation. Jiang Guanqing was impulsive, and he had worked hard to restrain himself during their southward journey to Stalactite Mountain. With these 3 people visiting the wine shop, They didn't need to be afraid of Chen Pingan attacking them, nor did they need to be afraid of Chen Pingan going all out against them. Even if Chen Pingan let Lin Junbai down, for example, if he were as impulsive and boastful as Zhang Guanqing, they still had senior brother Bianjing to keep them safe. Moreover, Chen Pingan would have made many enemies if he had gone overboard. This was the reason why Zhu Mei and the others had felt so guilty and ashamed when standing outside the pavilion in Sword Immortal Sun Jiyuan's residence, with even the proud and haughty Yan Lu feeling slightly uneasy. Lin Junbai hadn't become angry at all, since it was important to treat his pawns well. This was the first lesson Lin Junbai had learned from the imperial preceptor of the Shaoyuan Empire, the teacher who imparted upon him knowledge, and the master who taught him Dao power. People and pawns were ultimately different, with people having their own lives to live, their own paths of the great Dao to follow, and their own emotions and desires. Viewing them as mindless pawns and wantonly throwing them around would mean that one wasn't far away from death. In reality, with the exception of his scheme pertaining to the wine shop, Lin Junbai had indeed treated his companions with honesty and respect during their southward trip to the Sword Qi Great Wall. He hadn't kept any secrets when his companions asked him for help regarding scholarly studies, sword techniques, and Go techniques. While traveling south, Lin Junbai had carefully learned about the prodigies in the 8 continents beyond the Middle-earth Divine Continent, especially those with extremely unique personalities. For example, the Northern Complete Reed Continent's Lin Su, the Pure White Continent's Lu Yuzhou, and the Eastern Treasured Vial Continent's Ma Kushuan. He could learn from each of them, observing their lives to temper his own Dao heart. However, Lin Junbai was slightly flustered right now, feeling as if he were completely alone on the Go board, unable to draw on any power or external help. He had nothing but himself and his bonded flying sword as he faced this dangerous situation. While staying at Sword Immortal Sun Jiyuan's residence, Lin Junbai had honestly revealed to Bianjing that he didn't want to face off against Chen Pingan so early. He was not even 15 years old after all, so he indeed wouldn't stand a chance against Chen Pingan. This was the case with Chen Pingan, so he naturally stood even less of a chance against Ning Yao. Lin Junbai's confidence stemmed from comparing the future him in 10 years' time to the current Chen Pingan or Ning Yao. Or in a similar vein, comparing the current him to the past Chen Pingan and Ning Yao from 10 years ago. The second lesson from his master, the imperial preceptor, was that those who were unwilling to admit defeat in battle would die very easily. Lin Junbai's mind whirred, and he hoped to find a flawless plan that could help him break free from this situation. As for why Lin Junbai was targeting Chen Pingan and thinking about him so much, this was naturally due to the ripples caused by the battle between the third and the fourth sages. Confucian disciples cared deeply about the concept of respect toward heaven, earth, rulers, parents, and teachers, and on the path of cultivation, one would often enjoy the closest relationship with one's teachers. During the early stages of a cultivator's life, their masters would accompany them for the longest and have the greatest impact. Lin Junbai was no exception, and upon joining a certain lineage or orthodoxy, one would very likely inherit the friends and foes of the said lineage or orthodoxy. There was strong hostility between his master and that old scholar, and the Shaoyuan Empire had been the first place to ban the scholarly sage's works and teachings, doing so the most ruthlessly among the empires in the Middle-earth Divine Continent. However, the imperial preceptor, who initially had the chance to become the mountain master of a Confucian school or even the deputy sect master of the Confucian temple, never expressed much animosity or resentment when he privately talked about the old scholar. In fact, he would even express approval and appreciation when he didn't talk about the old scholar and only talked about the old scholar's teachings. This caused Lin Junbai to feel even more displeased. Ning Yao didn't say anything else after her blunt statement to Lin Junbai. In her eyes, the choice in front of Lin Junbai was very simple. Either he didn't draw his sword and admit defeat, or he drew his sword and was defeated, also suffering a bit more in the process. Thus, she didn't understand what there was to think about. Ning Yao didn't like this young man, who couldn't control his eyes and wasn't good at speaking properly. He also schemed and calculated too much, with his thoughts being impure. Sword cultivators needed to strive forward with conviction, so by purposely suppressing his cultivation base, was he truly not willing to respect his bonded flying sword? If the many criticisms leveled at sword cultivators and flying swords by the 3 teachings and the 100 schools of thought could be attributed to a difference in philosophy and Tao, Then what about sword cultivators themselves being unwilling to show any sincerity? So after Lin Junbai drew his sword and lost, Ning Yao would offer a single remark. There are a myriad of immortal techniques in the world, yet only a flying sword is the most direct. Of course, she could save herself the effort if Lin Junbai admitted defeat without drawing his sword. Lin Junbai felt the most awkward right now, and Yen Lu, who was about to take part in the second trial on the street, also felt very awkward. As for Lu Tiefu, the Dragon Gate tier sword cultivator who was conducting the second trial for the Sword Qi Great Wall, he naturally didn't feel awkward at all. He felt very happy instead, and the reason for this was very simple. He regarded himself as Ning Yao's #1 admirer at the Sword Qi Great Wall, and he was extremely thick-skinned and shameless, even though he had grown up in the impoverished streets and alleys. In the beginning, Lu Tiefu had tried everything he could to get into the Ning residence. For example, he could become an unofficial disciple of Nalin Yexing, like Cui Wei, or a steward or servant who handled miscellaneous tasks at the Ning residence. Each time Lu Tiefu saw Ning Yao on the streets, however, he would flush bright red and hurriedly run far away, his head bowed and his back bent, satisfied with just taking 1 or 2 glances at her from a distance. He claimed that he would become pale and get sweaty palms if he stood too close to Ning Yao, and this could easily cause her to resent him. Thus, Lu Tiefu loudly told Yen Lu that the trial could wait until matters between Ning Yao and Lin Junbai were settled. As for whether Yen Lu could understand the local dialect, Lu Tiefu couldn't be bothered to think about it. In any case, he was already squatting on the ground and gazing at Miss Ning from a distance, waving his hands a few times and presumably trying to ask the young man standing beside her to shuffle aside, so that he didn't block Lu Tiefu from admiring Miss Ning. Of course, Lu Tiefu also felt admiration for that outsider called Chen Pingan, but he still felt like Chen Pingan wasn't worthy of Miss Ning, despite his defeating Qi Shou and Pang Yuanji not long ago. However, he would tolerate this since Ning Yao liked him. It wasn't like he could do anything about this anyway. Since he couldn't defeat Chen Pingan in a fight, all he could do was find an opportunity to visit the wine shop, drink some wine, and inscribe his name on a safety tablet, using the backside to secretly write, "Miss Ning, I'm very sad that you already have someone you like." The second time Lu Tiefu visited the wine shop to drink, Chen Pingan had stood at the entrance and beckoned to him with a smile, saying that the two of them needed to have a good chat. Lu Tiefu had turned around and sprinted away without saying so much as a single word. Afterward, he had only dared to ask someone else to investigate whether his safety tablet was still hanging in the wine shop. After learning that it was still hanging there and hadn't been tossed out, Lu Tiefu felt like Chen Pingan was quite a decent person. It wouldn't have made sense for Miss Ning to be attracted to a petty person. The sword immortals who had rushed over from the city wall landed on the walls of the wealthy residences lining the 2 sides of the street. Not only that, but even more sword immortals were clearly flying over on their swords. Lin Junbai appeared calm and composed as he cupped his fists at Ning Yao and said, "I'm young and naive, so I apologize for offending you. I admit defeat." Bianjing breathed a sigh of relief. Lin Junbai, a future pillar of the Shaoyuan Empire's sword Dao, choosing not to draw his sword was correct. Otherwise, Bianjing would need to worry about Lin Junbai's sword heart crumbling in this foreign land, and at that time the Imperial Preceptor definitely wouldn't let him off lightly. In contrast to Lin Junbai's thorough consideration of everything, Bianjing wouldn't think so much, and he would only choose 1 or 2 threads of events to investigate and understand in depth. For example, there was a saying at the Sword Qi Great Wall that Ning Yao was one type of sword cultivator, while everyone else was another type of sword cultivator. In addition, Ning Yao had participated in many battles on the battlefield to the south, and she had also traveled around the majestic world by herself at a very young age. She definitely wasn't the type of extremely talented but extremely naive prodigy. As such, Ning Yao's statement was a reflection of her absolute confidence in achieving victory. It was essentially the same as drawing her blade. It was for this reason that Bianjing didn't need to think deeply about the destructive power of Ning Yao's flying sword, nor about her mystical abilities or cultivation base. There was no need to. Then what's the point of you coming to the Sword Qi Great Wall to practice sword techniques? Ning Yao asked. Lin Junbai smiled faintly and replied, "There's no need for Big Sister Ning to worry about this. I naturally have my own path of the Great Tao to follow." Ning Yao frowned and said, "Take back your words. Do outsiders now need to speak and tread so carefully at the Sword Qi Great Wall? Won't I need to tremble in fear and hesitation when launching sword strikes in the future? Lin Junbai asked in exasperation. Ningyao turned around to look at Chen Pingan. Chen Pingan smiled and said, "Don't worry about my opinion. Ningyao, you are you." Bianjing stepped forward. After all, he couldn't stand there idly and watch Lin Junbai struggle against their foes. He was still very young, so his so-called calmness and composure were largely still a facade, gained from his many years of study with the Imperial Preceptor. He was yet to grasp the essence. Moreover, there were many sword immortals spectating the battle, and this naturally put far too much pressure on Lin Junbai. Yen Lu and the others failed to notice any signs, but Bianjing was abundantly aware that Lin Junbai was already nearing the limit of his self-restraint right now. Those who contemplated too many matters would often become especially reckless and uncaring when they lashed out. Before leaving the Shaoyuan Empire, the Imperial Preceptor had specially looked for Bianjing to warn him about this matter, hoping that his unofficial disciple could help his junior brother during such critical moments, making sure that Lin Junbai wouldn't lose the metaphorical game of Go and suffer damage to his great Tao. The Imperial Preceptor hoped that Bianjing could help Lin Junbai win this game of Go. This was because in the Imperial Preceptor's eyes, the objective of his prized disciple traveling to the Sword Qi Great Wall wasn't to practice his sword techniques, but instead to cultivate his heart. Indeed, for a prodigious innate sword talent like Lin Junbai, it would make little difference whether he cultivated his sword Tao in the mountains away from mortal distractions, in the mortal streets and alleys, in the Imperial Palace, or in the martial world. The problem specifically was Lin Junbai's extreme conceit and his failure to realize this. His sword skills would definitely improve, and there was absolutely no need to worry about this. However, his heart needed to shift toward the mean and refrain from moving to the opposite extreme. Otherwise, he would face the catastrophe of his Tao heart becoming impure, and his sword heart being shattered. In fact, even Bianjing felt slightly jealous of his junior brother, what with the Imperial Preceptor providing him with such careful and meticulous guidance. Chen Pingan smiled and stepped forward at almost the exact same time as Bianjing, looking at the like-minded person who was also very skilled at keeping a low profile and pretending to be weak. However, it was a shame that Bianjing had only reached the level of pretending to be a son, not yet that of pretending to be a grandson. He still had much room for improvement, and he had given away far too many clues during the confrontation at the wine shop. His acting hadn't been natural enough, and at the very least, the shock on his face and the flustered nature of his actions had appeared a little over the top. His performance wasn't good enough for Chen Pingan. You might think that we're forcing outsiders to pass the 3 trials is a show of strength and a form of humiliation. But this isn't the case, Ningyao said. In actual fact, this is a show of respect granted by sword cultivators of the Sword Qi Great Wall. What does it matter if an outsider loses 3 battles in a row and fails to pass the 3 trials? Daring to come here and temper their cultivation, and daring to ascend the city wall to glance at the savage world, is already proof enough of their identity as a sword cultivator. However, so be it if you're so focused on the 3 trials so much so that you even created a new set of rules to scheme against the Sword Qi Great Wall. When it comes to fighting on the battlefield, it's a reflection of your capability if you're able to scheme and achieve victory over your foes. Sword cultivators speak with their swords, after all, so a victory is a victory. The spectating sword immortals smiled knowingly and nodded in approval. Who hadn't been young before? The large majority of local sword immortals had once personally participated in the 3 trials. This was a different story for the younger sword cultivators, who all exchanged baffled glances with each other. Were they truly as generous and noble as Ningyao described? Was their true intention not to pummel the outsiders and have them eat dust? For example, they had initially wanted to enjoy a good show as they watched Qishou and his companions, as well as Peng Yuanji, who should have been only a spectator, battle the second shopkeeper. The black heart and miserly second shopkeeper, shockingly managing to achieve victory, was obviously another matter altogether. No matter what, Ningyao's statement wasn't wrong. Regardless of where from the majestic world one hailed from, the sword cultivators at the Sword Qi Great Wall wouldn't bear any ill will toward those who were truly powerful. They would, more or less, be willing to show sincere respect toward these powerful individuals. Casting one's gaze over the sword immortals, there was the godforsaken Aoyang, the sublimely skilled Zui Yu, and the carefree Wei Jin from the small eastern treasured Vile continent. Looking at the younger generation, there was first the immortal demeanor of Chao Ci, and there was now the utter shamelessness of Chen Pingan. Lin Junbai took a deep breath and asked, "Will you only relent after I draw my sword to fight?" "I was only being polite just then, and I wanted you to draw your sword because I didn't like the look of you," Ning Yao replied. "Since you've admitted to being young and naive, I can suppress my cultivation base to fight against you. Yet, you still don't dare to draw your sword, so what else needs to give for you to draw your sword? Change your opponent to Gao Yuqing." After saying this, Ning Yao turned her head to look at the young woman who was standing between Gao Yeho and Pang Yuanji. The rims of her eyes were puffy and red, and Ning Yao said, "What are you crying about? You can go home and cry." In reality, there weren't any tears on Gao Yuqing's face at this moment, yet she still hurriedly wiped her face in fright. It was also at this moment that Bianjing knew that things were going south, and he was just about to make a move. However, he hesitated for a split second after seeing the look in Chen Pingan's eyes. Lin Junbai felt as if he had been plunged into a glacial pit. Flashes of sword light appeared around the street, and in the next instant, it was as if Lin Junbai were trapped in a large formation of flying swords. Dozens of bonded flying swords, that seemingly belonged to upper 5-tier sword immortals and earth immortal sword cultivators surrounded Lin Junbai, with the purity of their sword intense and the concentration of killing intent as real as could be. Each flying sword hovering around him was pointing in a different direction, but without fail, they were all pointing at Lin Junbai's most critical acupoints relating to his cultivation. However, this wasn't the most chilling aspect for Lin Junbai. What made him feel the most despair was the flying sword hovering 3 meters in front of him and pointing at his glabella. Lin Junbai's bonded flying sword was called Flood Dragon Slayer, and the flying sword hovering in front of him was none other than the Flood Dragon Slayer. Lin Junbai's bonded flying sword was naturally resting in his acupoint, and the flying sword hovering in front of him was naturally a replica. However, apart from Lin Junbai being unable to communicate with this flying sword, its aura, sword intent, and divine intent were shockingly identical to his bonded flying sword. In fact, Lin Junbai even questioned whether this replica flying sword, which shouldn't have appeared in the world, would possess the same bonded mystical abilities as his Flood Dragon Slayer. To say nothing of Lin Junbai being shocked, this was also a surprise for Chen Pingan, who finally understood at this moment why Ning Yao had nonchalantly offered that response during their casual talk. "Cultivation bases are meaningless to me." However, it was a pity that Ning Yao never liked to discuss her cultivation with Chen Pingan. Most of the time, she would patiently listen to Chen Pingan talking about those trivial matters, at most reaching over to slap away his wandering hands. Following his feeling of great despair, Lin Junbai was astonishingly forced to face even greater despair. If it was already astounding enough for Ning Yao to release dozens of flying swords of varying strengths, even releasing a replica of Lin Junbai's bonded flying sword, to surround and trap the young man, then it was even more unfathomable for her to summon several dozen more flying swords to link together and create a formation around herself, creating a genuine isolated small world using some unknown mystical ability. Ning Yao had indeed suppressed her cultivation base to the C observation tier, and she was standing amid the formation of flying swords just like that. However, could she still be regarded as a C observation tier cultivator? To say nothing of Lin Junbai, would his senior brother Bianjing, who was at the peak stage of the Golden Core tier, be able to shatter this isolated small world with his flying sword? "Draw your sword," Ning Yao instructed in a calm voice. Lin Junbai was stunned, and he didn't draw his sword as he asked in a quivering voice, "This is clearly a sword technique, so how is it so divine and profound?" "Sword techniques stand atop all immortal techniques in the world. You don't even know this?" Ning Yao asked. "You didn't think that the sword immortals at the Sword Chi Great Wall only know how to wield their long swords and flying swords on the battlefield, did you?" She looked at the young man and shook her head, retracting the flying swords surrounding him as well as the isolated small world around her. The dozens of flying swords around Lin Junbai disappeared in a flash. "Don't!" Bianjing shouted in a soft voice. He strode forward, no longer caring about keeping his cultivation base concealed as he attempted to stop Lin Junbai from recklessly summoning his bonded flying sword. Chen Pingan had already noticed the young man's sinister plans beforehand, but he still didn't make a move, simply standing there with his hands inside his opposite sleeves and calmly letting Ningyao deal with the situation. Ningyao was the strongest among the younger generation, so she had naturally participated in the most battles and earned the most military merit as well. A small and exquisite sword formation appeared in front of Ningyao, dazzling gold as it suppressed and captured the flying sword, Flood Dragon Slayer, that Lin Junbai had suddenly unleashed. Not only that, but the dozens of flying swords that had just disappeared from around Lin Junbai suddenly reappeared and shot forward like arrows, instantly piercing through dozens of his acupoints before stopping and flipping around, with their tips pointing outward and their hilts pointing at the young man. Among them, the replica Flood Dragon Slayer flashed across Lin Junbai's glabella before hovering 3 meters behind the young man, with a drop of blood gathering on the tip of the flying sword. Lin Junbai was bloodied and on the verge of collapsing. He stared intently at Ningyao, who had seemingly become a sword immortal already. He was destined to lose, and it would serve him well to admit defeat, yet 2 specks of golden light suddenly shone brightly in the depths of his eyes. These were surprisingly 2 bonded flying swords that had been hidden and nurtured in his eyes for many years. In other words, Lin Junbai was just like Qi Shou, also possessing 3 bonded flying swords. However, the dozens of flying swords that had lightly wounded Lin Junbai before stopping and turning around immediately drew numerous colorful arcs through the air as they surged forth and gathered in front of his eyes. Lin Junbai remained unmoving. However, his Yin soul left his body and took several steps sideways, holding a sword and preparing to launch an attack on Ningyao. Ningyao also remained unmoving, with her Yin soul floating out of her body and appearing like an immortal. It held a pseudo-celestial tool that had already been refined into a bonded item, and it didn't spare so much as a single glance at Lin Junbai's Yin soul, as it pushed the tip of its sword against the young man's head. Restraining myself from killing you is more difficult than casually killing you and being done with it, so you need to cherish your life, Ningyao said slowly. Only at this moment did Lin Junbai understand why the Imperial Preceptor had stated that there still existed a huge gulf between fellow prodigies. Lin Junbai was drenched in blood, with his eyes dull and his heart ashen. Bianjing purposely slowed down in order to express his sincerity, and he strode to Lin Junbai's side and placed a hand on the young man's shoulder, saying in a solemn voice, "It's inevitable that you win some and you lose some when playing Go." A small glimmer of light returned to Lin Junbai's eyes. A spectating sword immortal smiled and said, "This wasn't satisfying enough." Little Ning still withheld more than half of her strength even after suppressing her cultivation base. Standing beside him, his good friend remarked, "It's good enough already. Perhaps we would have performed even worse when we were the same age as that stupid young man. Maybe that's due to enjoying too much wine from Chen Pingan's wine shop," Sword Immortal Tao Wen suddenly suggested. Many Sword Immortals nodded in agreement. An elderly Immortal Tier Sword Immortal smiled and said, "Little Ning, your replica of my flying sword was a bit lacking and missing some essence. Say, are you looking down on my bonded flying sword?" Another elderly sword immortal who was spectating the 3 trials from his own residence on Taixiang Street snickered and said, "Your crappy flying sword was lacking to begin with, only protecting its tip and failing to protect its hilt every time it's used in battle. What's the point of creating a good replica?" Lu Tiefu wiped the rims of his eyes, feeling extremely emotional as he watched on. This was as expected of Miss Ning, the young woman whom he only dared to secretly admire from a distance. She was far too powerful. Still standing with his hands inside his opposite sleeves, Chen Pingan said frankly to Lin Junbai, "Victory and defeat are only a small matter in your eyes, and the notion of face is only slightly more important. In any case, was it really a loss for you to face Ningyao's sword strike? So you can give up your act and happily take the benefits. You can go home and celebrate in secret. Otherwise, I genuinely won't hold back against you anymore." Chen Pingan then smiled at Bianjing and said, "You're worrying about him for nothing." Lin Junbai paid no heed to Chen Pingan's words, retracting his Yin soul and his flying sword before cupping his fists and saying, "Thank you for your guidance, Senior Ning. Junbai will remember this lesson for life." Ningyao retracted her Yin soul and replied, "Whatever you want. In any case, I definitely won't remember you." She then turned her gaze to Yan Lu and Lu Tiefu, furrowing her brows and asking, "Still enjoying the show?" Lu Tiefu immediately jumped up. Good heavens, Miss Ning had actually taken a glance at him. He was feeling tense, truly quite tense. Meanwhile, Yin Lu felt the second trial would be pointless and uninteresting, whether it went ahead or not. Winning wouldn't bring any satisfaction, and losing would only bring humiliation. The two sides most likely wouldn't go all out in the subsequent trials, nor would anyone have much interest in watching them. After Ningyao retracted her own soul and weapons, many sword immortals stepped on their swords and left, flying far into the distance. Moreover, these lofty immortals looked to be quite amused and happy as they left. Lin Junbai appeared shaken and unsteady as he turned around to leave. Ningyao's flying swords hadn't wounded his foundation, and he simply appeared very disheveled and miserable on the outside. Just like Chen Pingan had said, Lin Junbai's Dao heart wasn't damaged too much because Ningyao had proved that her sword Dao was indeed far too superior. Even so, Lin Junbai was naturally impacted, and there would definitely be a shadow hanging over his sword heart for several years to come, appearing like a formless mountain that suppressed his mind's lake. However, Lin Junbai was confident that he could blow away this shadow and push away the mountain. In fact, what repulsed him most was Chen Pingan's comments after the battle, which left him feeling incredibly pent-up and frustrated. Bianjing walked to Lin Junbai's side. Lin Junbai was as pale as a sheet, but he still smiled and said in a soft voice, "I'm okay. I can accept a loss." Bianjing turned around to look at the extremely punchable young man in azure, having a slightly strange feeling as he did so. The punchable aura of Chen Pingan was slightly different from that of Chao Ci. Chao Ci's martial art skills were magnificent and profound, and engaging in close-quarter combat with him was like gazing up at a towering mountain. Thus, even if Chao Ci didn't speak, he would still be seemingly saying to his opponents, "You truly can't defeat me, so I suggest that you don't even try." Meanwhile, it was seemingly as if there was a message scrawled on Chen Pingan's forehead reading, "You can definitely defeat me, so why don't you give it a try?" Bianjing couldn't help but sigh with emotion. Had he come across a like-minded person who was his senior? Following Lin Junbai and Bianjing's departure, Zhang Guanqing and the others left as well. Lin Junbai didn't forget to nod at a certain golden core tier sword cultivator, with the latter also nodding in acknowledgement. Zhu Mei was still unwilling to leave, but only 5 or 6 others stayed behind to accompany her. There were still 2 trials to be completed after all. Zhu Mei felt slightly strange at this moment. Ningyao was formidably powerful, and after seeing her launch a sword strike just one time, an overwhelming sense of admiration spontaneously arose in Zhu Mei's heart. However, why was Ningyao attracted to that young man standing beside her? Just how scatterbrained was celestial maiden Ning when it came to romantic relationships? Chen Pingan and Ningyao walked over to Yanzhua and the others. Following Ningyao's arrival, no one on the 2 sides of the street dared to cheer or boo anymore. It was no wonder that a certain saying was so popular throughout the Sword Qi Great Wall. What to do if Ningyao unleashes a sword strike? Being 1 cultivation base higher won't help at all. This made Chen Pingan feel both very happy and also very aggrieved. Why was he the only one who was unpopular? This was despite the fact that many bastards called him a brother as they drank with him or squatted on the side of the street and ate pickled vegetables with him. Dai Zhang was extremely buoyant as she whispered with Ningyao. Chen Pingan rubbed his chin, turning to Fan Dach and saying, "Hey Dach, what's the matter now?" Fan Dach asked in a slightly tense voice. "What do you think about me as a person?" Chen Pingan asked in a sincere voice. Fan Dach shot a careful glance at Ningyao before nodding vigorously and replying, "I think you're a very good person." Chen Pingan humbly sought advice, asking, "Is there anything I need to work on improving? I very much like to hear other people directly and honestly pointing out my shortcomings." "There's no shortcoming to point out," Fan Dach said resolutely, shaking his head. Ningyao smiled faintly and nodded in agreement. Fan Dach almost shed tears upon seeing this. As it turned out, Miss Ning would have truly held it against him if he hadn't called Chen Pingan a good person. Miss Ning wasn't this kind of person before. Meanwhile, on Ink Stick Street, Yin Lu and Lu Tiefu began the second battle. There were many more exchanges in this battle compared to the swift battle between the Sea Observation Tier Lin Junbai and Gao Yuqing, with the 2 of them unleashing all kinds of techniques. Chen Pingan watched very carefully. "Is there any need to watch this battle so attentively?" Chen Sanxiu asked in puzzlement. Chen Pingan nodded in response, carefully observing the complex movements of the 2 flying swords as he replied with a smile, Apart from my friends, I first and foremost view everyone else as a formidable enemy. Fandach hesitated for a while before asking in an uncertain voice, "Do I also count as a friend?" Chen Pingan subconsciously retracted his gaze and looked at Fandach, replying, "Of course." Fandach mustered his courage and asked, "You view me as a friend, but I'm still less of a friend than Sancho and the others, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't need to explicitly look at me when speaking with me." Chen Pingan couldn't help but falter upon hearing this. He didn't deny Fandach's accusation. Instead, he smiled and remarked, "Say, you're a grown man, so why are you so sensitive?" Apart from Ning Yao, everyone else chuckled and looked at Chen Pingan. Fandach quietly shuffled to the side, a forced smile on his face as he lightly elbowed Chen Sancho and said, "A pot of wine that costs 5 snowflake coins. I understand." "You don't understand shit," Chen Sancho replied with a huff. "Dach, you can visit the Ning residence more often with Sancho in the future," Chen Pingan suddenly said. "We'll enter the training ground one after another to spar with you, and if you actually manage to break through, then remember to visit the wine shop for a drink and give me a yell. We'll treat that pot of wine, which costs 5 snowflake coins a pot, as a celebration gift." Fandach faltered and fell silent. Chen Sancho stepped on his heel, and only then did the latter return to his senses, nodding in response and saying okay. Sure enough, Yan Lu won the second trial by a small margin. Just as Chen Pingan had expected, Lu Tiefu wasn't embarrassed too much in his defeat. Boos rang out on the two sides of Ink Stick Street, but the relatively shameless Lu Tiefu cracked a grin and cupped his fists, thanking the Sword Immortals for coming here to watch his battle. Sita Weiran was responsible for conducting the third trial. Her opponent was a golden core tier sword cultivator called Jian Jinming, someone who had just advanced to the level of Earth Immortal not long ago. He was in his 30s and an extremely renowned prodigy in the Shaoyuan Empire. However, he was completely overshadowed by the talents of Lin Junbai and Yan Lu, and the backgrounds of Zhu Mei and Jiang Guanqing, in this southward journey to the Sword Qi Great Wall. Jian Jinming wasn't the type of competitive sword cultivator who liked to stand out and achieve victory either, so he didn't feel much displeasure even though he was abundantly aware that Lin Junbai was treating him as the only forfeited ghost stone in the 3 trials. He was able to battle against a genuine prodigy the same age as him from the Sword Qi Great Wall, so there was nothing for him to feel disappointed about. Traveling south to Stalactite Mountain with the young prodigies and staying in the Plum Blossom Garden, after which they traveled to the Sword Qi Great Wall and settled down in Sword Immortal Sun's residence, Jian Jinming listened to and obeyed Lin Junbai's instructions the entire time. He had his own plans, but these all pertained to the sword. Thus, even though the outcome of this trial was a foregone conclusion, it felt most like a proper sword duel out of the 3 trials. Sita Weiran didn't seek speed with her sword strikes, instead treating this trial as a form of training. And thus Jian Jinming sheathed his sword and conceded defeat 15 minutes later, with the proud and haughty Sita Weiran also having a rare smile tug at the corners of her lips. She retracted her sword and also cupped her fists in respect, disregarding everything else and focusing on the 3 trials alone. Lin Junbai and the outsider sword cultivators had actually achieved an overwhelming victory. After all the other disruptions, however, Lin Junbai and his companions obviously wouldn't regard this as a victory, not in the least. The spectating sword cultivators dispersed following the conclusion of the 3 trials. Many people directly visited Dai Zhang's wine shop for a drink, and they found the free dish today, the additional battle between Ning Yao and Lin Junbai, incredibly thrilling, especially compared to the extremely salty pickled vegetables. It was much more delicious. However, there was also a free bowl of Yangchun noodles now, so they would put up with the second shopkeeper for the moment. Ning Yao didn't go to the wine shop, saying that she needed to return home to cultivate. However, she reminded Chen Pingan not to drink too much, seeing that he was still wounded. "What's the matter with you?" Yanzhua asked. Chen Pingan smiled and replied using his mind's lake. "I've been refining my bonded item these past few days, but I've come across a small hiccup." Yanzhua didn't ask anything else. Chen Sancho didn't say anything either. A peculiar phenomenon had seemingly appeared at the Ning residence before, one that even ordinary sword immortals couldn't detect. However, it had surprisingly caught the attention of old ancestor Chen Shi, and Chen Sancho had felt extremely baffled about his old ancestor's sudden appearance during his sword training. Chen Shi had smiled and said to Chen Sanqiu, I surmise that it's about time for the old monk who's been nodding off on the city wall for many years to open his eyes and take a look. Sword Immortal Sun Jiyuan's residence was identical to the extravagant residences in the majestic world, and it had taken him an exorbitant amount of immortal coins to achieve this similarity. Sun Jiyuan was sitting on a bamboo mat that almost filled the entire corridor, and exquisite paperweights held down the four corners of the mat, each made from a different material. The Middle-earth Divine Continent Sword Immortal, Ku Xia, stood beside him, his expression solemn. Sun Jiyuan smiled and said, This start hasn't been ideal, but we can't blame Lin Junbai for his oversight. We need to blame your name instead. It's summer right now, yet your name's Ku Xia or Painful Summer, so you've clearly affected Lin Junbai in a detrimental manner. He shouldn't have provoked Ning Yao, Ku Xia said in exasperation. Sun Jiyuan smiled and replied, Keep stating the obvious, why don't you? How many sword immortals were spectating the battle before? 30? Including those who didn't show themselves. It's been a long time since things have been so lively at the Sword Qi Great Wall. It would be a huge fortune if a young woman like this could marry into the Shaoyuan Empire. Perhaps the Empire's sword Dao fortune would be dragged up by a significant amount. Ku Xia remarked with a sigh of emotion. Sun Jiyuan snickered and said, You should stop standing there and daydreaming. Lin Junbai can already be regarded as the embodiment of the Shaoyuan Empire's sword fortune. But so what? He's not even worthy enough for Ning Yao to remember his name. In any case, little Ning once left the Sword Qi Great Wall and traveled across many continents in the majestic world by herself, yet not a single person was able to convince her to stay. So you should keep quiet if you aren't capable, and you shouldn't blame little Ning for having incredibly high standards. Sun Jiyuan paused for a moment before exclaiming in astonishment, It can't be that the imperial preceptor of the Shaoyuan Empire genuinely wanted Lin Junbai to come here and steal away our prodigies, right? Is Lin Junbai aware of this? Ku Xia remained silent. The amused smile vanished from Sun Jiyuan's face as he continued in a solemn voice. If that's truly the case, then I suggest you give up straight away and directly quash the thought in Lin Junbai's mind. No matter how much faith the imperial preceptor of the Shaoyuan Empire has, it ultimately can't compare to the life and great Tao of a sword immortal. If the naive Lin Junbai, who's still wet behind the ears, fails to keep himself in check, then there's no need for Ning Yao to target him at all. Just the schemes and plots of Chen Pingan would be enough to cause endless trouble for Lin Junbai and his companions, including Bian Jing. Ku Xia looked over and asked in puzzlement, I've heard some stories about this young man before, so I'm not surprised that the younger generation of cultivators at the Sword Qi Great Wall are all apprehensive of him. But why do sword immortals like you hold him in such high regard as well? Regarding some internal matters and secrets, sword immortal Ku Xia wouldn't talk about them, even though he had a life-and-death friendship with Sun Jiyuan. Thus, he directly avoided talking about these matters. Sun Jiyuan was sitting cross-legged on the straw mat, and he flicked his hand and caused a wine cup to materialize in his palm. He then shook it gently, causing fine wine to appear on its own in the cup. This wine cup was the most coveted item by alcoholic immortals in the world, even more so than those wine insects. This wine cup was called Wine Spring, and unless one drank from morning until night without stopping, guzzling down 50 liters in a single sitting, it was like a huge wine vat that couldn't be emptied. Thus, only 3 such wine cups existed in the Sword Qi Great Wall, a place that housed countless alcoholics. One was owned by Sun Jiyuan, one was owned by Yan Ming, though this sword immortal seemingly didn't drink again after losing his arms and suffering a drop in cultivation base, and one was owned by old sword immortal Qi. There once existed 5 wine springs at the Sword Qi Great Wall, but someone had hosted a bet and tricked them into giving 2 away. Right now, it was unknown whether these wine cups had returned to the majestic world, or whether they had been directly taken to the heavens beyond heavens outside the heavenly world. The person who had taken the 2 wine cups away had even said that good things needed to be in pairs, and the wine cups could be like husband and wife. That would be better than the wine cups being as lonely and pitifully single as their owners. Sun Jiyuan downed the wine in a single gulp, following which the wine cup filled itself again as if there existed a spring. He smiled faintly and asked, Ku Xia, what do you think a powerful person should appear like? Ku Xia shook his head and replied, I've never thought about this before, nor can I be bothered thinking about such matters. So please enlighten me, Sword Immortal Sunday. Sun Jiyuan held his wine cup with 2 fingers and gently swirled the wine around, looking at the faint ripples shimmering across the surface as he said slowly, "These individuals cause good people to feel like they're good people, and they cause their enemies, regardless of their stance and regardless of whether they're good or bad, to willingly acknowledge them as good people from the bottom of their hearts." Ku Xia mulled over this for a long time before nodding and saying, "That's terrifying." "But this isn't the most terrifying thing," Sun Jiyuan said with a shake of his head. "Care to explain?" Ku Xia asked with a frown. "The most terrifying thing is that these people are genuinely good people," Sun Jiyuan replied slowly. "How my heart views the world is how the world should view me." Sun Jiyuan recalled one of the seals recorded in the seal manual of the 100 Sword Immortals. The one with the inscription, "Observing Dao Temple, Dao Observing Dao." This was extremely interesting and immediately caught Sun Jiyuan's eye. However, it was a pity that the seal was already nowhere to be found, secretly obtained by some unknown sword immortal. Sun Jiyuan suddenly chuckled in speechlessness, glancing into the distance with an ice-cold gaze and remarking, "Just what kind of kids are they? So be it if it was just Lin Junbai. He's a smart person after all, and it was a pity that he came across little Ning." Even if Chen Pingan purposely exposed his thoughts, Lin Junbai could simply chuckle in secret and not push his luck. As for the others like that Jiang whatever his name was, he's your direct disciple, right? Have they run over here to play around at the Sword Chi Great Wall? Things will be fine if a battle doesn't break out, but what will they do if a battle truly breaks out? Will they run over and offer their heads to those beastly demons? As a sword immortal, doesn't your heart feel tired? Is this the current culture of the Shaoyuan Empire? If I remember correctly, you and your companions weren't this pathetic when you came to the Sword Chi Great Wall back then, right? Ku Xia didn't say anything, falling silent for a moment before finally replying. The Imperial Preceptor issued a command, saying that they can't leave the city wall even if a large-scale battle breaks out. Sun Jiyuan slapped his forehead and downed the contents of his wine cup, using it to wash away his worries as he lamented. "My residence is like a filthy street now. Sword Immortal Ku Xia, the summer is truly painful now. As it turns out, I've been screwed over the most by you." There was a slightly apologetic expression on Sword Immortal Ku Xia's face, but he didn't say anything else. There was no need to be overly polite with his good friend. However, Ku Xia, the martial nephew of one of the top 10 cultivators in the Middle Earth Divine Continent and a well-established pillar of the Shaoyuan Empire, couldn't help but ponder Sun Jiyuan's remark. Perhaps his name was truly a little mystical and efficacious? Die. Over at the pavilion, Lin Junbai had already changed into a Dao robe, with his expression also returning to normal. He appeared spotless and carefree, much like an elegant young immortal. Bianjing, who had already given away some clues, was most likely the only sword cultivator with a deep frown on his face. This was because many of the other youths were cursing in fury, while the remaining youths consoled themselves with remarks they considered reasonable and fair. These youths weren't even aware of the significance and purpose of the 3 trials, so Bianjing wondered to himself why they were even coming to the Sword Chi Great Wall. Had the seniors of these youths not taught them anything before their departure? Or perhaps the naivety of these youths reflected their seniors' incompetence. Maybe these seniors had strongly encouraged the youths to keep a low profile and live with their tails between their legs at the Sword Chi Great Wall, only to have this instead stir their rebellious nature? In reality, none of these youths knew anything about the savage world, much less the ferocity of the demon tribe as they assaulted the city wall. Bianjing would even go as far as to say with absolute certainty that these youths, including Lin Junbai, regarded the young sword cultivators at the Sword Chi Great Wall as their greatest opponents and enemies. They completely brushed aside the threats posed by the savage world and the demon tribe. Bianjing was much better in this regard, since he had personally faced the formidable combat power and extremely tough physique of a nascent tier demon during his travels in the Flowing Dawn continent. He had launched countless sword strikes with his companion, a nascent tier sword cultivator, yet they had still failed to truly wound their opponent. Only with the help of an additional golden core tier sword cultivator had they managed to slowly wear out the demon and grind it to death. The 3 trials were difficult to pass. What was the purpose of this? The Sword Chi Great Wall hoped that outsider sword cultivators would pay closer attention and be more careful. understanding that each victory achieved by the Sword Chi Great Wall against the demon tribe was extremely difficult. At the same time, the 3 trials could serve as a warning to outsider sword cultivators, especially the younger generation, convincing them to stay on the city wall during battles against the demon tribe, if they didn't have enough battle experience. These inexperienced sword cultivators could provide some minor help from the sidelines, controlling their flying swords to attack the demons. However, they definitely shouldn't act rashly and jump down the city wall to charge into battle. The many sword immortals at the Sword Chi Great Wall wouldn't explicitly restrain people from doing this, especially since they wouldn't have the effort or spare time to worry about so many matters. As for the outsiders who purely traveled to the Sword Chi Great Wall to temper their sword Dao, the Sword Chi Great Wall wouldn't discriminate against the people either. It was simply a matter of the strength of these sword cultivators, whether they could truly make a name for themselves or catch the attention of a sword immortal, allowing them to learn top-notch sword techniques. Just how old is Junbai right now, and just how old is Ningyao in comparison? Her victory was unfair, yet she still had the gall to talk down to us? Is this the strongest sword cultivator of the Sword Chi Great Wall's younger generation? In my view, even if the destructive power of the sword immortals here is boundlessly vast, their minds are truly as narrow as a needle's tip. That Ningyao clearly knew those sword cultivators from the Sword Chi Great Wall wouldn't be able to defeat us in the 3 trials, so she purposely stepped forward and forced Junbai to draw his sword. She was far too overbearing and aggressive. That's right. And those spectating sword immortals, they all harbored ill intentions, and they were purposely creating a tense atmosphere to put pressure on Junbai. Zhang Guanqing chuckled coldly and said, "If you ask me, I'd say that Ningyao didn't suppress her cultivation base at all. It was all a facade, and she purposely used an underhanded method to defeat Junbai, all for the sake of protecting her pitiful fame and status. Even Ningyao is acting with such shamelessness, so how much better can Peng Yuanji, Qishou, Gao Yeho, and the others be sword cultivators who just barely belong to the same generation as us? Sure enough, this is a savage and barbaric land." Bianjing reached up and massaged his temples. This was giving him a big headache. Fortunately, Lin Junbai furrowed his brows and warned, "Watch your words, Zhang Guanqing." Zhang Guanqing finally shut his mouth, but the anger and indignation on his face couldn't be concealed. Zhu Mei stood among the crowd but remained silent. Jin Zhimeng, the Golden Core tier sword cultivator, also didn't participate much in the conversation. Zhu Mei had recalled Gao Yuqing, the young woman who had lost the first trial, and scrunched up her face, shedding tears as she silently stood beside Gao Yeho and Peng Yuanji. She also recalled Lu Tiefu, who had been met with rowdy cheers and relentless boos after his loss. Even so, the young Lu Tiefu had still managed to put on a grin, cupping his fists and thanking the crowd as he faced a barrage of ridicule and scolding. Meanwhile, Jin Zhimeng was thinking about Situ Weiron's smile and reciprocal gesture following the latter's victory over him. At the same time, he recalled how the atmosphere on Ink Stick Street had suddenly become solemn following the arrival of Ningyao. This hadn't been as simple as people calming their breathing and focusing their attention to enjoy the riveting show. One of the youngest girls, who was only 12 years old, was especially furious, unable to wipe away her gloominess as she said quietly, that Chen Pingan was especially bad. He insisted on targeting Junbai the entire time, and he was clearly feeling inferior and ashamed of himself. What does it matter that he was able to defeat Qishou and Peng Yuanji? He's the closing disciple of the scholarly sage, and he's also the junior brother of great sword immortals Wu Yu, so he's been gifted countless immortal treasures thanks to his master, and he's been receiving careful guidance from a paramount sword immortal day after day, year after year. That being the case, is it impressive for him to possess such capabilities? If we give Junbai another 10 years, I surmise that Chen Pingan won't even dare to breathe too loudly in front of Junbai. Bianjing wailed in anguish in his mind. Goodness me, young miss, you can't spout nonsense like this simply because you like Junbai. Lin Junbai shook his head and said, Chen Pingan is quite an exceptional person. He isn't as pathetic as you guys make him out to be. He then smiled and continued, if my opponent were too weak, then wouldn't that make me even more pathetic and mediocre? Upon hearing this, the young girl felt like Lin Junbai was even more impressive and perfect. Bianjing promised himself that, no matter the situation, He would definitely refuse to participate in the foolish adventures of these young masters and young mistresses in the future. They could do whatever they wanted. He wouldn't entertain their rubbish. Speaking truthfully, Bianjing hadn't exactly been tending to them anyway, and he had instead treated them as live entertainment while traveling south. The only fortunate thing was the imperial preceptor, his half-master, saying frankly that these young masters and young mistresses wouldn't participate in the large-scale battles against the demons. Once war broke out between the Sword Chi Great Wall and the demon tribe, these young prodigies would immediately retreat to the Plum Blossom Garden in Stalactite Mountain. Afterward, they would embark on the return journey to the Middle-earth Divine Continent. It was best that they didn't even linger in the Southern World Continent. Bianjing massaged his cheeks and quietly prayed that no one would notice him. Unfortunately for him, however, Jiang Guanqing didn't let him wriggle free, exclaiming in exuberance, "Aha, so senior brother Bianjing concealed his power the best." That Chen Pingan was clearly very worried about whether senior brother Bianjing would step forward to interfere. There was a look of helplessness on Bianjing's face. "Young lad, you're completely blind, okay?" Jiang Guanqing's remark instantly livened the atmosphere and triggered spirited discussions between the young sword cultivators. Bianjing listened to the relatively sincere words of praise, yet he couldn't bring himself to feel happy at all. He involuntarily felt a sense of unease as he thought of the young man who was smiling with squinted eyes and holding his hands inside his opposite sleeves, and he had a nagging feeling that things weren't as simple as they appeared. Bianjing ignored the sincere compliments and the scheming praises as he turned his gaze toward Lin Junbai. Lin Junbai smiled faintly and said, "I'll remember to be careful." Bianjing breathed a small sigh of relief. By the looks of it, his junior brother's initial plan of breaking through twice in quick succession and engaging in 3 battles at the Sea Observation Tier, the Dragon Gate Tier, and the Golden Core Tier was seemingly the most optimal choice. If they had followed through with that plan, perhaps many of the spectating sword immortals would have developed a good impression of Lin Junbai. This was unlike the current situation, where many sword immortals regarded Lin Junbai as a complete joke, wholeheartedly siding with Ningyao instead. If they had followed Lin Junbai's initial plan, what would it have mattered even if they had given Chen Pingan the opportunity to force a 4th battle? At that time, Lin Junbai would have achieved victory even if he lost the 4th battle, and the more he fought to his heart's content, the more the spectators would have developed a good impression of him. This was the same principle as Chen Pingan fighting against Pang Yuanji. In fact, if Lin Junbai managed to force Ningyao to draw her blade, rather than just face Chen Pingan, who was seemingly picking on someone exhausted after 3 battles, then he would achieve an even greater victory. However, this was nothing more than a what-if. Bianjing wouldn't be so foolish as to ask his junior brother whether he felt any regret. He most definitely wouldn't reveal that his remark to Lin Junbai at the time, "It's fairly pointless to fight with other people for the sake of so-called victory or defeat," was actually a reminder for Lin Junbai to compete with himself instead of competing with other people. Saying this would be planting animosity between him and Lin Junbai. It was minor fullness, the 8th solar term, and the radiant sun hung high in the sky. Chen Pingan didn't stay in the wine shop to drink, so he was oblivious to how much criticism and abuse he had already received. He carried a small stool to the corner of the alley and explained the origin of the 24 solar terms to the growing number of children who were gradually returning. He pulled out some phrases from his hometown such as, "If minor fullness isn't full, there'll be no water to wash your stools." At the same time, he didn't forget to occasionally use a mishmash of phrases together. For example, "Wheat ears growing in minor fullness and swaying like children, dreaming of its fragrance as I sleep at night." However, it was a pity that the children were largely uninterested in learning characters and the 24 solar terms, or whatever today, and they had zero understanding of the dry, grating phrases that Chen Pingan was reciting. Like little birds chirping around him, they were all asking about celestial maiden Ningyao, making an exception today and drawing her sword on Ink Stick Street, curious about what that looked like. Chen Pingan raised his bamboo stick and brandished it around, giving a lavish and exaggerated recount of Ningyao's battle against Lin Junbai. The father of the little boy, Kangol, was now working as a noodle chef at the wine shop, which gave him newfound courage, and he even dared to talk back to his wife when he returned home. Kangol was still the same as always, finding great joy in challenging Chen Pingan and messing around with him. After hearing Chen Pingan's recount, He asked how many Chen Pinganists it would take to defeat Big Sister Ning now. This was a difficult question, and Chen Pingan was rendered speechless. The children rolled their eyes upon seeing this. Feng shook his head and patted Chen Pingan's knee, saying with an air of maturity, "Chen Pingan, you always come here to wander around aimlessly, not focusing on practicing martial arts or training sword techniques. If this continues, I say that Big Sister Ning will eventually complain about you being weak. So what if you defeated Peng Yuanji? Just look at how cocky you've become. Always liking to act like some impressive grandmaster in front of us. You're slacking off all the time. And this definitely won't serve you well in the long term." The children standing around him nodded in agreement. Chen Pingan placed the bamboo stick horizontally across his knees, then reached over to squeeze Kangle's cheeks as he said with a wide smile, "Shut your trap." The little boy reached over in an attempt to hit Chen Pingan, but it was a shame that his arm was too short and couldn't reach Chen Pingan. A young boy squatting furthest away from Chen Pingan recalled the commotion from before, and he said with a grin, "Speak up, Kangle. I, Chen Pingan, am the esteemed closing disciple of the scholarly sage, and I can't hear you properly." Loud laughter immediately rippled through the group of children. There was an abundance of news and rumors about the second shopkeeper now. Chen Pingan smiled and remarked, "You children are still young, or else I would strike one with my fist, hit two with my kick, and scare you all away with my sword." Feng massaged his cheeks before raising his bum and craning his neck. Crap, that little girl from Yanqi Alley, who was the most beautiful in the world, was indeed standing nearby and looking at him. What should he do now? Relying on the fantastical stories from Chen Pingan, he had succeeded in having her agree to play the role of his wife when playing house one time. Afterward, he had spoken with her again when regurgitating Chen Pingan's explanation of Yanqi Alley's name. She still didn't speak with him much when they came across each other on the streets and alleys, but were her large and blinking eyes not a form of greeting? This was what Chen Pingan had told him after listening to his troubles. After hearing this, he now giddily rolled around in bed before going to sleep every night. And thus Feng immediately sat up straight and secretly gestured to Chen Pingan using his eyes, after which he grumbled in a quiet voice, "It's all your fault, Chen Pingan. I'll scold you to death if she starts ignoring me in the future." Chen Pingan chuckled and replied, "Thanks to the Yangchun noodles cooked by Kangle's dad, I've decided to tell everyone an additional story about ghosts and gods today. I promise it will be spectacular." A young boy appeared unimpressed as he said, "Chen Pingan, you need to first tell us the cultivation base of the main character who slew demons and upheld justice for the heavens. Don't get to the end and tell us that he's only a crappy lower 5-tier cultivator again. Otherwise, according to your stories, all of the sword cultivators from the Sword Chi Great Wall will be like grandmasters and lofty immortals if they go to your hometown. How is that possible?" "Yeah, that's exactly right," another child concurred. "You purposely make the ghosts and spirits sound so terrifying when they appear, making me feel like they're similar to the great demons from the savage world." Chen Pingan cleared his throat, recalling something and turning his head, extending a palm to a young girl squatting nearby. The young girl hurriedly placed a handful of roasted seeds in his palm, after which Chen Pingan smiled and returned half of the roasted seeds to her. As he snacked on roasted seeds, Chen Pingan started to say, "The young sword immortal whom I'm talking about today definitely has a sufficient cultivation base. He travels across the martial world with his sword, and his appearance is the definition of elegance and carefree. Countless gallant female martial artists in the martial world and innumerable celestial maidens in the mountains admire him and feel affection for him. Yet this young sword immortal who goes by the name of Qi Jinglong is stubbornly unmoved by their feelings. Qi Jinglong has yet to meet a young woman whom he truly likes, and the water ghost that he's destined to face off against in the end is most definitely frightening enough." "How is it frightening?" "Well, please allow me to slowly explain. Imagine that you come across a body of water, for example, any random puddle forming in the alleys due to the rain, a bowl of water at home, or when you flip open the lid of your water vat. You look over and without any warning, boo! To say nothing of you guys, even that sword immortal called Qi Jinglong became pale with fright when he saw that deathly pale face suddenly poke out from a clump of water grass while cupping his hands and drinking water on the bank of the river. One of the children was already given a huge fright, exclaiming with an aggrieved expression, "Boo you Chen Pingan! Who is this Qi Jinglong?" someone suddenly asked. Chen Pingan smiled and replied, "A young sword immortal who loves to drink wine, but likes to pretend that he doesn't enjoy wine. He loves to speak reason, and he's as annoying as can be." "How old is this sword immortal?" Feng asked. "Yet to reach 100 years old," Chen Pingan replied. Feng clicked his tongue in wonder and commented, "And you still have the gall to call him a young sword immortal? Hurry up and change the description to old geezer sword immortal." Chen Pingan twisted the little boy's cheek and replied, "He's my good friend, yet you dare to speak of him in such an impudent manner?" Feng grimaced and stood up, with his bum raised as he hammered Chen Pingan's shoulder and scolded, "I don't even hold back against you, so why would I hold back against your friend?" Standing in the distance, the mouth of the fair-skinned little girl became slightly agape. She hadn't imagined that Kangol would be so daring in front of Chen Pingan. By the looks of it, he genuinely hadn't been making things up in front of her. Chen Pingan tossed a glance at Feng Kangol, and the little boy lightly nodded in response, signifying that he understood. An observant young boy standing nearby couldn't help but roll his eyes. This second shopkeeper truly had nothing better to do. Did he truly not need to cultivate? He was mucking around with them every day, and he was even playing the role of a matchmaker now? Chen Pingan picked up his small stool and finished up for the day after relentlessly startling the children with his story. It was always better when Chen Sancho was at the wine shop, as this would guarantee him a spot at the wine table. The young boy Zhang Jiazhen was busily working in the wine shop, serving wine and Yangchan noodles to the sword cultivators. The young boy didn't like speaking, but the smile on his face was already enough. Chen Pingan sat down at a wine table today but didn't drink, only asking Zhang Jiazhen for a bowl of Yangchan noodles and a dish of pickled vegetables. At the end of the day, this could be blamed on Chen Sancho and Fatty Yan for lacking the necessary skills when it came to encouraging others to drink. Before returning to the Ning residence, Chen Pingan turned around and said in warning, "Hey Dach." Fan Dach, who was currently slurping down his bowl of Yangchan noodles, immediately felt as if he were facing a formidable enemy. In fact, he would feel anxious whenever he heard Chen Pingan addressing him in this manner now. He hurriedly replied, "I've already purchased a pot of wine for 5 snowflake coins. You decided not to drink it, and that's not my fault." Chen Pingan put down his chopsticks and said with a huff, "You said before that you would visit often, so don't go back on your words and treat this as a passing remark. Don't make me squat outside your residence every day, begging you to spar with me. At that time I might accidentally go over the top and send you crawling back home immediately after you step out. Yet, even your parents won't recognize you, and they'll kick you straight back out." Fan Dach nodded in understanding. Chen Pingan smiled and looked at Fan Dach. There was a puzzled expression on Fan Dach's face. Chen Pingan turned around, looking toward the young boy who was constantly keeping an eye on the customers in the wine shop. "Zhang Jiazhen, bring me a pot of the cheapest wine," he shouted. "I'll pay, but put the tab under Fan Dach's name. The next time I visit to drink, remember to ask me whether Fan Dach has repaid the money yet." Zhang Jiazhen nodded earnestly, hurriedly walking inside the wine shop to grab a pot of bamboo sea small world wine. To this young boy from an impoverished alley, Mr. Chen was like an immortal from the heavens. Chen Sancho, the young master from Taixiang Street, also appeared like a lofty immortal. If it weren't for working a part-time job in the wine shop, perhaps Zhang Jiazhen would have never gotten the opportunity to speak with Chen Sancho in his lifetime, much less have his name remembered by this young master. After all these years, Zhang Jiazhen had never once visited Taixiang Street or Ink Stick Street, not a single time. No one stopped him from visiting, but like all of the other children from Spirit Rhino Alley, Yanqi Alley, and the other alleys with nice names that belied their impoverished nature, he had never even thought about visiting these wealthy streets. Even if these impoverished children occasionally thought about visiting, they would ultimately fail to muster the courage to truly walk over. Chen Pingan smiled at Zhang Jiazhen, after which he pointed at Fan Dach before standing up and leaving with a pot of wine. Fan Dach continued to eat his Yangchan noodles with his head lowered. Truth be told, without Chen Pingan's final remark, Fan Dach genuinely didn't know how he should visit the Ning residence. After all, what if Chen Pingan had simply been speaking politely before? He had said to visit often to spar, but how often was often? Once every 3 days? Once a month? Was it that easy to enter the gates of the Ning residence? Fan Dach looked up at the young man in azure who was disappearing down the street. That young man cocked his head and looked at the horizontal scrolls plastered above the entrances of the restaurants and wine shops, shaking his head from time to time. Nalin Yeshing opened the door for Chen Pingan when he arrived back at the Ning residence. They walked to the training ground together, and Nalin Yeshing raised the pot of wine in his hand and asked with a smile, "Did you pay for this yourself?" Chen Pingan smiled and replied, "I'm taking a leaf from Dong Huafu's book. It's foolish to pay for wine." Nalin Yeshing laughed heartily and said, "Let me take a few swigs of wine before I draw my sword in a moment. That way, I'll be able to unleash more power when helping you examine the dragon." The smile disappeared from Chen Pingan's face. Ning Yao had said she was returning home first to cultivate, but in reality she was chatting with Grandma by the entire time at the pavilion atop dragon-slaying cliff. Upon noticing that Chen Pingan had come back so soon, Grandma Bai chuckled and left the pavilion without needing any warning from the young mistress. Afterward, Ning Yao finally began cultivating. On the training ground in the minute-small world, Nalin Yeshing put away the remaining half a pot of wine and started to unleash ferocious sword strikes at Chen Pingan. In the end, a small slip-up from Nalin Yeshing, despite his taking extreme care already, was enough to leave Chen Pingan bedridden for 10 days to half a month. Grandma Bai hurriedly made her way to the training ground, and Nalin Yeshing almost ran away from home in fright. Fortunately, Chen Pingan explained to Grandma Bai that he had gained a lot from this lesson, and that this cultivation path was the correct one. Moreover, there was no need to brew any medicines, and allowing his body to heal on its own was also a form of cultivation. Nalin Yeshing didn't dare to make things up, and he said honestly, "This is indeed the case." Ning Yao helped Chen Pingan back to the wing room. Nalin Yeshing was filled with apprehension as he waited for a severe scolding, but Bai Lianshuang unexpectedly remained silent as she gazed at the disappearing figures of the two people for a long time. Nalin Yeshing felt like this wouldn't do, and he was better off facing the music sooner rather than later. He was just about to ask Bai Lianshuang for a scolding, but the old woman didn't look like she was intending to scold him and call him an old dog. Instead, she sighed with emotion and asked in a soft voice, "Say, do you think Chen Pingan and young mistress resemble master and mistress when they were young?" Nalin Yeshing retrieved his remaining half a pot of wine before nodding and saying, "Yes, of course. You've worked hard for the past while," Bai Lianshuang said with a stern expression. "What?" Nalin Yeshing exclaimed, baffled. "Old dog, piss off and guard the entrance," the old woman fumed. Nalin Yeshing nodded in satisfaction. This was more like it. He turned around and walked to the entrance, feeling much more reassured than before. Die. Chen Pingan sat on his bed and began cultivating, his mind completely immersed in the small world of his body. Ning Yao sat beside him, resting her arms and head on the table as she looked at Chen Pingan. He seemingly met some person he wanted to meet in his heart, and a smile subconsciously tugged at the corners of his lips. She knew who this person was. This was because Chen Pingan had faced many challenges and bumps in the process of refining his fourth bonded item, and after successfully refining it with much difficulty, he had immediately embraced Ning Yao in front of Grandpa Nalin after walking out of the secret room and seeing her. Ning Yao had never seen Chen Pingan appear so relieved before, and Grandpa Nalin had tactfully taken his leave straight away. Feeling a little pained for him, Ning Yao had reciprocated Chen Pingan's embrace. Chen Pingan had glowed with excitement and vigor when he revealed to Ning Yao that the young boy still existed. As it turned out, the young boy had become a baldy and taken refuge in his heart. After reuniting and traveling along a certain path in his heart, the baldy had ridden on the fiery dragon and scolded Chen Pingan the entire time. Ning Yao had rarely seen Chen Pingan express his delight so openly, especially after he matured and grew up. In fact, Ning Yao also felt a little worried about Chen Pingan's interactions with others, given that his mental state was like that of a withered old monk who had lived for many years and had witnessed far too many joys, sorrows, reunions, and partings. Ning Yao didn't want Chen Pingan to be like this, so she was very happy upon seeing his exuberance, and it was as if they had returned to the time when he was a young boy, and she was a young girl. A friend had come from afar, a small baldy in his heart. The small baldy wasn't wearing Buddhist robes, and he was still wearing Confucian robes as before. However, apart from the sword hanging by his waist, There was now an additional Buddhist scripture in his sleeve. This was a reunion that Chen Pingan hadn't even dared to dream of. Before this reunion, he could only be consumed by guilt in his dreams, unable to let go even after he woke up. Yet, he was unable to confide his regret and guilt to anyone else. Far too many people in his life had left without saying goodbye, disappearing once and for all. Ningyao lay on the table and gazed at Chen Pingan, smiling to herself as she recalled what had happened on Ink Stick Street earlier. Chen Pingan had hesitated for a long time before holding her hand and secretly asking, "When I was the same age as Lin Junbai, was I more handsome? Or is he more handsome?" At the time, Ningyao had asked, "What do you think?" Chen Pingan had started to scratch his head, feeling like the answer would truly be a worrisome one. And thus, Ningyao had sincerely revealed the answer in her heart, not keeping it a secret as she told Chen Pingan. "You were much more handsome." Chen Pingan had raised his hands and gently brushed them along her brows, exclaiming, "Oh, my scatterbrain Ningyao, you truly have the most amazing judgment."